them together, what's it going to take? Is it the spending that's going to catch up to the sentiment, or is the sentiment going to rebound just given the spending trends that we've seen?
That's a great question. So our survey is really forward-looking and is sort of leading against these backward-looking spending indicators. So one thing that is different about this month relative to earlier months is that in earlier months, particularly in May, we had a bit of a separation in how people felt about the economy versus how they felt about their personal finances, which was a little bit more stable even as the overall index was going down. This month, we're seeing personal financial questions, sentiment also going down at the same time that the macroeconomic sentiment is going down as well. So at this point, the number one concern on people's minds that we're hearing throughout the survey is inflation, inflation, inflation. It's impossible to ignore and very difficult to avoid.
Are we seeing some stabilization in inflation expectations? You've revised that number back down a bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. So earlier in the month, we were seeing some signs that long-term inflation expectations were inching up. You know, as you know, the Federal Reserve hiked rates by 75 basis points, you know, higher than expected. And since then, we're seeing some initial signs of long-term inflation expectations coming back down. It's at 3.1, and it's been at 3.0 or 3.1 for all of 2022. But it's really too early to tell if we're at an inflection point. We'll really have to monitor things going forward. Uncertainty is really high when it comes to inflation. Our measures of uncertainty for long-term inflation is higher than it's been since 1991. So we really need to pay attention going forward to see if this uncertainty resolves.
Joanne, how much of the effects of consumer sentiment is really a result of coming of what you're seeing in perhaps the broader markets, the stock market, which you're seeing larger and larger household wealth invested into, now seeing a lot of red on the screen, a lot of red when you look at their year-to-date 401ks, for example. How much of that is feeding into the wealth effect, which is then again feeding into these ratings?
So what we are seeing by and large is the number one thing, it really is inflation. We are seeing some mentions about asset prices, but it's really dominated by inflation at all levels of income and wealth.
When you say inflation, do you mean gas prices?
Well, gas prices were spontaneously mentioned by about 50%, about half of our consumers in the survey. So certainly it is at the forefront of their minds. But it is clear that consumers aren't just responding to gas prices, but certainly that is something that is very salient for them.
Joanne, food prices as well soaring in line with gas prices. How many people are going to perhaps look and say, well, you know, we're not going to travel this summer just to make sure that we're able to feed our families?
I think the fact that all of our measures are trending down at the same time suggests that consumers are going to be trying to adjust their behavior in some way, whether it is by substituting types of goods or by cutting back on spending altogether. What remains to be seen is how strong this adjustment is and how fast it becomes.
Joanne, just looking at your panels, looking at the questions you're asking, the responses you're getting, do you get a sense that consumers think that the Fed has got a grip on the situation, or the Fed has not got a grip on the situation? Clearly, inflation is front and center for all of them. The Fed's job is to deal with it. Do consumers think that it is?
So what I can tell you is that there is a broad consensus among consumers that they expect the Fed to take action. Close to an all-time high of 86% of consumers expect rate hikes over the coming 12 months. That being said, it's really hard to say if consumers believe the Fed has it under control. You know, with the most recent large rate hike, we only have 5 days of data. Well, this is something we'll have to continue monitoring in the weeks ahead.
Joanne Shu of the University of Michigan Surveys of Consumers, thank you as always. Clearly a number that the Federal Reserve and investors around the world are watching as well. Coming up, what banks' biggest clients are worrying about these days? We're going to talk about volatility, supply chain disruptions, and the risk of recession with the CEO of BNP Paribas. That conversation is coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
If we do have a recession, it's likely that it would be on the shallower end for two reasons. One, private sector balance sheets are in better shape than at the end of previous business cycles. And two, I think, while inflation is very high, I don't think it's as entrenched, certainly not as entrenched in expectations as it was in previous high inflation episodes, 70s, early 80s.
That was Goldman Sachs chief economist Jan Hatzius earlier on Bloomberg Television, sounding somewhat optimistic on the economy, even if a recession does hit. You know what? We're actually going to hit some breaking news here, come back to the recession topic, because we are getting some breaking news here coming from the Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court issuing a Mississippi abortion opinion, and this, of course, upholding Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban. This is extremely significant as we talk about simply the wider array of the implications, Guy, of what's going to happen in terms of the national ban and what we can expect.
The Supreme Court has overturned Roe versus Wade. Let me just repeat that, because this is a huge moment for the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States has overturned Roe versus Wade, the abortion rights ruling. A huge moment, a hugely divisive moment for the United States. We have been waiting for this to come through, and now we have the details that we have been waiting for. We now know which way we are turning. The Supreme Court has overturned Roe versus Wade, the abortion rights ruling. Let's continue to talk about the implications of this. This is something that has been long in the making, long in the building, certainly for the Republican Party. They have watched very carefully over the last few years the influence that they have been extending over the Supreme Court. We certainly saw a significant number of justices as a result of the Trump administration placed on to the Supreme Court. Some would argue that this was one of the key objectives of that. So just to repeat again, the Supreme Court has overturned Roe versus Wade, the abortion rights ruling in the United States. We're going to spend the next hour or so talking about this. I appreciate that there is a lot going on elsewhere, but this is a seminal moment, a pivotal moment for the United States, and one that is going to have a defining influence not only on what comes up in the midterms, how the Democrats, how the Republicans are going to adjust their strategy to consider what is happening here, and then thinking about what happens 2 years after that in terms of the general election that likely is going to follow. I want to take you now straight to Washington, D.C. We've got a whole lineup ready to go to talk about this. I'm going to start with Bloomberg's Amory Hordern, who is down in Washington, D.C. Amory, talk about how much of a surprise this is in Washington, D.C., or maybe not a surprise. Talk to me about the implications of what is being announced on the screen right now.
Well, Guy, I think you're striking the right tone in saying this is really a historic moment. This is the biggest blow to women's reproductive rights in about 50 years. But are you surprised, individuals in D.C.? Not really, because, of course, last month, this opinion was leaked to Politico. So there has been, if you can almost say, just a waiting in Washington, D.C. for basically the T to be crossed in what many were expecting, which is that this Mississippi decision would be leading to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Now, Guy, you can imagine.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
But ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Stocked early enough all these precious materials you were just mentioning, and we were on the lucky side that our prognosis was spot on in a way, forecasting what kind of material we would need and what quantity we would need.
However you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
They're not partisan, they're not Republicans or Democrats, but certainly divided along ideological lines. I think that's absolutely right. Now, in fairness, I've just seen the slip of opinion. I have not gotten a chance to read it. I just read some of what's been saying about it. As far as I understand it, as important as what you just said, it's 6-3, but it's actually 5-1-3, which is an important distinction. Chief Justice Roberts concurred in the judgment, not in the opinion. That's something you can do in the Supreme Court, which is I don't agree with what they're saying. I don't agree with the basis of it. All I say is the ultimate result, which is the overturning the court below, I agree with that result. I haven't gotten a chance to read it carefully yet. I would bet you that what it is Chief Justice Roberts would have done this on a much more narrow ground, not a total overturning of both Casey and Roe versus Wade. So it's a 5 majority, 1 joining in the judgment, that is Chief Justice Roberts, and then 3 dissenting.
David, when you look at that divide, though, is it representing America? Is that, do you think, the consensus? Anne-Marie was talking about what opinion polls are telling us right now. Is the Supreme Court in any way representative in terms of the opinion that it is delivered here of the American people?
Well, 2 answers to that. Number 1 is the Supreme Court was never intended to be representative of the American people.
No, I appreciate that.
At a given time.
Yeah.
The whole reason they have that separate and they have life tenure is so that they are not subject to the whims of the American people from day to day. At the same time, they are broadly representative in the sense that they are appointed by political entities. The President of the United States was confirmed by the Senate. And many people today would say this does represent at least a significant element of the American people in the sense of the elections have consequences, as they say. Now, it's totally right that if you took a poll today, the majority, depending on how you ask the question, the majority of American people would say we do not want to ban all abortions. That's completely right. And in that sense, the Supreme Court is anti-majoritarian. But that's not the first time in the history of the United States that the Supreme Court's been anti-majoritarian. And the founders would say that was part of the purpose. The question is, have they gone too far?
David, let's get another opinion here. Joining us now on the phone is Bloomberg News diversity and sustainability reporter Rebecca Greenfield. Rebecca, thank you as always for joining us. This is a historic moment here, but it has some very real implications in the United States when it comes to women returning to work, a process that's really been lagging in the wake of COVID. What do the next couple of months, years even look like in terms of women going back into the workforce?
Well, I think immediately we will likely see that many states will ban abortion. We, have estimated that some 33 million childbearing women are set to lose access to the procedure in their home states. And we know that abortion has helped women economically, able to join the workforce, able to go to school, able to live the lives they want to live. So that, of course, will be a long-term effect, but immediately we'll likely see that women won't be able to get this procedure, or they will have to travel far and spend money to do it. When abortion was banned before, people still found ways to get abortion. So that's the other thing, that it takes time and money, and it is more disruptive to travel hundreds of miles or thousands of miles to get the procedure. So that's what the immediate looks like. And then, of course, long term, this is something that you can't. The knock-on effects of having a child or not having a unplanned child are, not something that we will see immediately at all. It is something that, over time. But lots of research has shown that the access to abortion has helped women join the workforce and have economic stability and independence.
Rebecca, it's David Weston. No question, economists are pretty unanimous in saying that there are real economic effects on women in particular from doing away with all abortions. But that raises the question, what might the political response be to a decision like this? Will this, do you think, put more pressure on the political branches to provide some support for women, such as, for example, childcare?
I can't speak for the politicians, but we thought that the pandemic would also result in more better government benefits for women, such as more subsidized childcare, more parental leave and paid family leave. And both of those things, though they got very close in Congress this fall and winter, just didn't happen. And that was after a lot of pressure from, political headwinds and also just, families who had dealt with this unprecedented childcare crisis and caregiving crisis, and it didn't happen. So maybe this will be the catalyst. I certainly can't say, but I think parents do feel like they are not getting much from the government at this point.
The economic effects are certainly going to be significant as we start to see this coming into force and the implications of it for the economy. I think a lot of people are going to be paying attention to that in a market that is already short of labour. Rebecca Greenfield, thank you very much indeed. Joining us now to dig further into the legal implications of all of this, Tina Davis. Tina, your reaction first of all.
Well, look, this is a very, very long opinion. It's more than 200 pages. I think what's interesting is that there was a little bit of a split in the court. As expected, there was a 6-3 majority, conservative majority, that ruled that the Mississippi ban, or the Mississippi law, which is a 15-week ban, so after you're 15 weeks pregnant, you can no longer get an abortion in Mississippi. There was a strong majority behind that, as expected. Obviously, during the oral arguments, we heard how some of the justices were leaning, so that's not a huge surprise. What is more surprising to me is that it was only 5-4, which is very narrow, to actually overturn Roe v. Wade itself and declare that there is no constitutional right in the United States to an abortion. So now it moves to the states. We have 13 states in the U.S. that have trigger laws. They're going to immediately put in place limits or outright bans on abortions. And then there's another 13 states, according to the Guttmacher Institute, that are likely to follow the same path. So it becomes, as Rebecca was saying, a little bit of where do you live in the United States as to what kind of access you'll have to this moving forward.
So, Tina, it's David Weston. I am curious about Chief Justice Roberts concurring in the judgment, not in the opinion, for the reason you described, which makes it sort of a 5-4 on the broader question of a total overturn of Roe and Casey. What practical effect could that have, though, for future litigation?
I suspect this issue will continue to come before the courts. You will see, in the same way that you've seen anti-abortion activists bringing cases again and again to try to get this kind of ruling, I think you're going to see the opposite as well now. And especially because there will be such a bifurcation in the United States between, places where this is allowed and places like New York and other states that are going to encourage and in some cases actually pay for people to come to their states for these services, and states where this is going to be banned. And we need to look also at the potential criminalization of this and whether or not we're going to have, district attorneys in various places that are going to refuse to carry out this law, as we've seen promised in places like New Orleans.
Tina, that was exactly where I wanted to go next, actually. This idea of how much liability does this perhaps create for a lot of workers, for a lot of corporate cases, in that perhaps either supporting or not supporting women getting that kind of access. How does this trickle down to the rest of the world?
Well, I think you raise an interesting point, right? Some companies have said, very few, have said that in places where abortions are currently very difficult, including Texas, that they would help their employees who need to get an abortion. And that means, paying for out-of-state travel, potentially supporting them in other ways. This does sort of, as you've noticed, this is an economic effect. This is more a have and a have-nots. As Rebecca said, if you have the money and the means, you're probably still able in the United States to get an abortion. What this does is, for some companies, they're going to have to make some more difficult decisions as to whether or not they want to try to put in place a broader policy.
But Tina, if I am a cab driver driving a woman to a clinic, if I'm driving her across a state boundary, do all corporates need to think about the potential implications of this?
Well, there's nothing in this law that says you are committing any kind of crime by aiding this. What this says is that the actual, the procedure cannot be done. That makes it illegal. I think what you're referring to is in Texas, there's a law that says, anyone that helps provide an abortion for a woman can also be found, can also be sued. So that's a little bit different, and we may see other sort of copycat laws in other states that try to go after the sort of full range of services and people who are part of this process, but that remains to be seen at this point.
Bloomberg's Tina Davis, thank you as always. David, let me hop back in here and bring it back to you. I'm curious simply about what this means or what the implications are on a more national level for the midterm elections. Of course, we're talking about a different branch of government here, the Supreme Court versus even state governments or even congressmen. But I have to ask, what are the connecting dots here?
Well, there's no question that this will galvanize a certain element, particularly of the Democratic Party, which has tended to be more pro-choice. And it will be used, perhaps first and foremost, for fundraising. It will be a fundraising source, without a doubt. The question is, given the way we're configured at this point and the gerrymandering that's been going on, will it make a difference? And let's talk about specifically in the Senate. The House of Representatives, most people think, probably will tilt over to the Republicans no matter what. Will it make a difference in the Senate? And that will be an interesting question, the extent to which, and this goes really specifically, we think, to suburban women. That is something that has been a real battleground for the parties. It's something that Donald Trump lost a lot of in the last election. It caused him to lose the election. And what this will do to suburban women. It's generally thought that this will hurt Republicans with suburban women. We'll see with that.
Nuestro estudio, nuestro experimento, no hemos pintado todos los edificios de blanco, sino estos más asequibles de pintar. Y ya hemos detectado reducciones medias en el área metropolitana de 0,8 grados aproximadamente en un periodo de ola de calor y con picos máximos de 4 grados de disminución en un momento puntual del día, en una zona puntual del día. Y como dices, en una ciudad como Barcelona funciona incluso mejor que las zonas verdes. Según las modificaciones, nos detectan incrementos, o sea, disminuciones de temperaturas mayores con tejados blancos que con incrementos de zonas verdes como tienen planteados el plan director urbanístico.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Already come out and said that they would help women if they're working and living in a state that does not allow them access to reproductive health care, that they would pay for them to go outside. But what about those women that are not. And if I could just quickly circle back to the political aspect we were talking about to David with, already we are seeing Democrats come out. You have a Senate panel saying they are going to hold a July 12th hearing on abortion rights ruling. And the inboxes of journalists in D.C. are just flooding with the Democratic Party already using this moment to urge voters to get out to vote and to vote on this issue.
Anne-Marie, we're going to hear from the president today, do you think?
If we're not going to hear from him verbally, we're certainly waiting for that statement. He's traveling tomorrow to Germany for the G7. I would be shocked if he didn't come out and verbally address the nation at this moment.
Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Jourdain joining us in Washington, D.C. We continue our coverage of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. Let's talk now to Terry Haynes, Pangea policy founder, a policy specialist. Terry, the decision is now out. We are now starting to see both parties responding. We've got the Republican leader, Mr. McCarthy, applauding the Supreme Court decision. As Anne-Marie was saying, we'll hear from the president in some shape or form today. Terry, how does this change the political landscape of the United States?
I think the obvious answer, Guy, is to say that we'll determine that in November. But let's get past that. I think where the most likely impacts come is not so much on federal, but as much more on states, because abortion proponents and opponents will think, and rightly will think, that what they need to be doing is focusing all their efforts on states immediately. And you and David have talked about this already, as has Anne-Marie, so I won't recap that. But very good discussion there. I think you'll see a lot of that. I do think you will see some changes in voter intensity among Democrats going into November, but I would really strongly caution against making too much of that. Places where abortion rights are strongest tend to be the most heavily blue or Democratic states already. So, it might have some impact in a swing state, it might not. But you will see certainly a little bit more voter intensity even in swing states and Senate races this fall. The other thing I would say, though, is I think that might be well matched already by anti-abortion activists who tend to already have more voter intensity. In other words, they have more motivation to get to the polls anyway this fall. So what you're going to end up with, I think, is largely a wash in most states that matter. Will it have a little bit of impact in the Senate races? Yeah. But I think the real action here is in the state legislatures much more, because, of course, those folks are going to have a very busy summer and fall trying to respond to this decision and trying to figure out, as David said a few minutes ago, exactly what is the level of the permissible. What can they do? What can't they do? From the court's from the perspective here, you're going to have roiling here that goes on into the midterms and beyond. So, so I think there's going to be a huge state impact. And as Anne-Marie said, I think a lot depends on what the president says today about this. If what he says is he's going to marshal all the powers of his office and go up to the Hill and really try to push for some federalized solution, for example, that's one thing. If it, as is much more common with him, he's going to say, I call on Congress to do this, that, or the other, that is going to be a weaker and more confused response. So there's going to be a lot as this settles out in the next 24 hours, there's going to be a lot of moving parts. And I think the president's statement and the intensity of it, frankly, is going to be one big part of that.
Terry, let's stick with that concept of simply this really fraught relationship now on the federal level to the state level for states like Texas, for example. I'm curious where that perhaps, I don't want to say animosity with too much emphasis there, but animosity between the two sides, where does that actually have ripple effects? Where does that have actual implications? Are things like funding to the states, for example, under perhaps revisiting?
I think that's a possibility. Yeah, it'd be too early to put a probability on it, but it will certainly impact. Let me put it this way: this is a little too Washingtonian, and I apologize, but it'll impact funding decisions this fall. I think we were already in a situation where where we were going to get a kind of a standstill federal government funding agreement, temporary, the same way we had last year, that would go in through the midterms. But I think what's going to happen is you're going to see an awful lot of people agitating on one side or the other to try to use the power of the federal government to extend the court's decision or to blunt it, frankly. And that's been going on since the Hyde Amendment in the early 70s, which restricted federal funds being used for abortion. So that's an obvious part of the playbook, and I think you're absolutely right to bring it up, because I think you'll be hearing about it quite a lot as the next few months go along.
Terry, Speaker Pelosi just issued a statement. Within that statement, she talks about the fact that the Democrats will aim to enshrine Roe versus Wade into law. You've already referenced this. Can you talk me through the mechanics of how that would work, how difficult it would be? Clearly, I'm assuming that it would be a fairly difficult path to walk. And given the time constraints as well, whether or not that is in any way going to be feasible.
About what they call black soot caused by the manufacturing and consumption of these fuel products in the illegal refineries.
Oil theft, known as bunkering, and the refining of its spoils is worsening the damage from decades of fossil fuel exploitation, creating one of the world's most severe ecological disasters.
Our sacred forests, our homes have to give way to oil wells, and no one gets much benefit.
Imagine a resident of Port Harcourt who inhales this soot every second in 24 hours, 7 days a week, 30 days in the month, and for years now, we are dying slowly but surely, and our lifespan is reducing every day.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
It's a great question.
Great question.
Great question.
Great question.
Great question.
That's going to be the best question I get all night.
I'm glad you asked that.
Bloomberg Television. Top experts. Great questions.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Conservative supporters who were very, enamored of these three. But now, the court went from a 5-4 conservative majority to a 6-3. We're seeing that play out here. It was a very narrow decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, and it is, again, the sort of payoff of the Donald Trump judicial appointments.
Tina, thank you very much indeed. We know you're going to have a lot to do throughout the rest of the day. We'll revisit your thoughts on how this is going to impact the legal system in America, what the next steps ultimately are going to be. Thank you very much indeed for that. Terry Haynes, Pangea policy founder, still with us. Terry, just let me come back to you. This is the long tail of the Trump administration. We knew that there was a plan in place. It had taken a long time for the Republicans to get to where we are now. They built towards it slowly. Just talk me through how that process happened and how this was such a large focus for the conservative element of the Republican Party that was able to manifest its opinions and get its influence sort of heard within the Trump administration.
Well, all very good questions. I assume you're going to give me the rest of the hour to answer. I'm kidding. Very quickly, I think what you see here is, historically, as much as anything else, is in this case particularly, is a rejection of the kind of government by judicial decree that really started with the Warren Court. Not on the Brown decision, not on the ending segregation decision, but on an entire parade for the following 15 years of judicial-made law. And what you had is so there was a reaction to that in the country, firstly, which reacted to that by putting Nixon into office. Ford comes after him, appointed, but kind of Reagan and moving forward. A much more conservative reaction to the idea that the Constitution fundamentally enshrines in our laws the ability of the people to decide major decisions. And so there has been, for the past 40 years, a fight between folks that like the judicial-made law and like the result they got, and folks who are saying, you know what, in this country, the how matters also. How something gets done matters, and the voice of citizens needs to be heard more on this, because if and they think you will get a better country if the citizens are more involved in, directly involved in decision making, and that the courts have taken a lot of that away. That sort of jurisprudence has thought has has seeped into jurisprudence, and the jurisprudence has become much more focused on kind of pushing back against the idea that, as long as you get the decision you want, no matter how it happens, doesn't really matter, to the no, how this happens is very important for the country. And so therefore, as Justice Kavanaugh says in his concurrence, the court is neutral on abortion, but it is what matters is essentially how this decision is made and who should make it. And the court, part of what the court is saying is that the court should not be making this decision, and in fact, the court should never have been making this decision in the first place. So what you're going to get is a lot of, I think, going forward, outside of abortion, by the way, I think you're going to get a court essentially telling elected representatives on both the federal and state levels, look, start doing your jobs. Don't push this off on us. You all need to start figuring this out and letting voters and citizens participate in these decisions as well. I hope that makes sense.
It certainly does. Terry Haynes, Pangea policy founder, thank you as always for your insights. Still with us is Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern joining us from Washington. Anne-Marie, let's expand on what Terry was really saying there, this relationship in terms of who actually makes the decision as opposed to not really being in the Supreme Court's hands, or shouldn't have been to begin with. At least that's one of the arguments being made. Let's return to the state level here. What is the significance of this decision or of this authority returning to the state level when in the United States you can just drive across borders to get an abortion if necessary?
Well, two things. One, a lot of women are going to have to do that. But another is that a lot of states have on books stricter abortion laws. But the fact that Roe v. Wade was the law of the land and it was a constitutional right those laws basically became void. Now there is going to be a lot of tough fights within states. And as Terry was saying, if this was going to change on a federal level, that would have to be done in Congress. And we already saw the Democrats try to do that this year. In May, Senator Schumer tried to do that, and it was blocked. I just looked up the count as a reminder, 49 to 51. If the country wants to enshrine abortion rights into law, then that would mean that they would need a 60 majority in the Senate. That is why you have Democrats coming out and trying to galvanize voters, saying if you don't like this decision by the Supreme Court that is blocking, for what, 50 years, women's rights to an abortion and reproductive health rights, then you need to vote us in. That is going to be the message, and we're going to be hearing from Speaker Pelosi. Already she is out with a statement. A woman's fundamental health decisions are her own to make in consultation with her doctor and her loved ones. She called this a cruel ruling and outrageous. But, you know, we need to remember, at this moment, this is also a massive win for individuals like Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who really set the stage over the years when it came to how justices were going to get through the Senate approval. Remember, there was Merrick Garland during the Obama years. Remember how quickly he moved to get Trump's pick, Amy Coney Barrett, through when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. He has said that the Supreme Court landmark ruling in Dobbs is courageous and correct. And this is going to be the tone right now at the Supreme Court. You have individuals from both sides of the political spectrum coming out and either bashing this decision or really proud of this moment.
Anne-Marie, given the strength that they now have on the Supreme Court, what else potentially could be on the agenda here?
Well, we need to see, right, what comes up. This one was really a very much so big one. Also yesterday, what happened in regarding states and the Constitution and whose law it is regarding the right to bear arms that we saw in New York. You could potentially see more cases where there is a conservative tilt, and that's very obvious, right? With a 6-3 split, that it leans very heavily on the conservative side. But I would say for this cycle of opinions, this was going to be the biggest and the most important, and this was the one that everyone was waiting for.
Anne-Marie, let's pivot a little bit here and talk about the set, where we are. We're looking at live images here.
Companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad, that we are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
I think the part of the world will be relatively shocked, right? This the largest GDP in the world, right? This is the land of free rights, democracy, and they'll be concerned from some places where this, for many countries in the world, this was an issue that was talked about 50 or 70 years ago, and then it was put to bed. So I think there's probably a lot of questions as why these issues can get recycled in America when many people had thought that it was put to bed and that this was a constitutional right, and the Supreme Court ruled on it once, and that was that. I also think, Guy, and this is talking a little bit more abstract, does this reflect also the concerns countries have around the world, especially as the president is about to go to the G7, about just the changing political dynamics and the pendulum that swings in American politics, right? You have President Biden saying America is backed. He, at this moment, has been able to coalesce allies in this moment with this Russia invasion of Ukraine, putting harsh sanctions on Russia. Allies, though, maybe won't say it out loud, but behind closed doors, they are concerned about what if there was an error where you did have a president similar to former President Donald Trump that did want to take aim at allies. So I think this just reflects that sometimes confusion and unease the rest of the world has with dealing with America. What America are you going to get every 4 years?
Anne-Marie, thank you very much indeed. Anne-Marie's going to continue to be with us as we continue to digest and figure out the implications of this decision. Kate Barn, Washington Center for Equitable Growth. She is the director there. She focuses very much on the economic implications. She's the chief economist, in fact. Kate Barn, can you just walk me through what you think the economic implications of this are likely to be? There is clearly, at the moment, a significant labor shortage in the United States. Women make up a huge portion of the US labor market. How will this affect that?
Yeah, I mean, there are broad effects of this. And so I could dig into a lot of them. The immediate ones are direct costs to people who may have to take time off of work to access services across state lines. But I think what you're digging into are what I call indirect costs, or these sort of secondary costs. When we have half of the workers in the country who cannot plan for their careers, may have a harder time completing education, making career choices. Those are exactly the types of barriers that we don't want in an economy that is recovering from a pandemic, where we want workers going back into jobs. We want them going to jobs they're well suited to. And taking away people's ability to plan for their own lives, plan for their own families, does exactly that. It takes away their ability to engage fully in the economy.
Kate, I have one statistic here by an analysis done by the Institute for Women's Policy Research, calculating that such measures cost state and local economies $105 billion annually. We were just talking to Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy about simply the economic costs and now the funding measures that you're starting to see in the state side of things. Your take on what this means for costs. And of course, we're going to come back to that. And for now, tune in and listen to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
Certainly is not one. This morning, the radical Supreme Court is eviscerating Americans' rights and endangering their health and safety. But the Congress will continue to act to overcome this extremism and protect the American people. Today, the Republican-controlled Supreme Court has achieved their dark, extreme goal of ripping away a woman's right to make their own reproductive health decisions. Because of Donald Trump, Mitch McConnell, and the Republican Party, their supermajority in the Supreme Court, American women today have less freedom than their mothers. With Roe and their attempt to destroy it, radical Republicans are charging ahead with their crusade to criminalize health freedom. In the Congress, be aware of this, the Republicans are plotting a nationwide abortion ban. They cannot be allowed to have a majority in the Congress to do that, but that's their goal. And if you read, and again, we're all studying all this, but if you read what is in the very clear, one of the justices had his own statement. It's about contraception, in vitro fertilization, family planning. That is all what will spring from their
decision that they made today. It's such a contradiction. Yesterday, they say the states cannot make laws governing the constitutional right to bear arms. And today, they're saying the exact reverse, that the states can overturn a constitutional right for 50 years, a constitutional right for a woman having the right to choose. The hypocrisy is raging, but the harm is endless. What this means to women is such an insult. It's a slap in the face to women about using their own judgment to make their own decisions about their reproductive freedom. And again, it goes well. I always have said the termination of a pregnancy is just their opening act. It's just their front game. But behind it, and for years, I have seen in this Congress opposition to any family planning, domestic or global, when we have had those discussions and those debates and those votes on the floor of the House. This is deadly serious, but we are not going to let this pass. A woman's right to choose, reproductive freedom, is on the ballot in November. We cannot allow them to take charge so that they can institute their goal, which is to criminalize reproductive freedom, to criminalize it. Right now, they're saying in states that they can arrest doctors and all the rest. What is happening here? What is happening here? A woman's fundamental health decisions are her own to make in consultation with her doctor, her faith, her family, not some right-wing politicians of Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell.
Soaring energy prices and a short supply of key chemicals that produce synthetic fertilisers are sending pig, cow and horse manure prices soaring. Even human waste is in demand as farmers hunt for alternatives. Fertiliser helps increase crop yields.
You can see how much moisture is held into this. It's a lot of organic material into the compost. So it breaks down, the manure and the straw breaks down into a friable mix that can be mixed into your soil in the ground and for growing a whole range of different vegetables. Holds the nutrients in, holds the water in, and it really increases the kind of biodynamic profile of the soil.
The recent price spike could mean more farmers going organic for the long term.
Without diversity, life would be excruciatingly dull. It's something worth celebrating. It's something that makes us stronger as communities, as businesses, and as individuals.
I see the benefits at Bloomberg on a daily basis. It's beyond flying that rainbow flag. It's about taking the discussions out into the world and making a genuine difference.
sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Keep moving toward background checks, but universal background checks, which will save the most lives. But this will save lives. And to listen to Lucy McGrath and other family members of those who have lost their loved ones, this is a giant step forward. Maybe not so much a giant, but a strong step forward. And if it's good enough for them, then we rejoice in passing it. As I say to members all the time with legislation, do not judge it for what isn't in it, but respect it for what is. And there's much to be respected in this legislation. On a happier note, yesterday we celebrated 50 years of Title IX, which has transformed equality and opportunity in our country. Are you familiar with the words of Title IX? Yesterday we had Billie Jean King here once again celebrating Title IX, unveiling a portrait of Patsy Mink, who is the author in the House, working with Birch Bayh in the Senate to make this the law of the land. And this is what it says. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Again, in honor of this anniversary, we unveiled a portrait which will hang in the halls. It's about our she's actually the first woman of color to serve in the Congress. So she's honored for her first, but also for what she accomplished. We already have painting of Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman, and for her many accomplishments here. And of course, Jeanette Rankin, the first woman ever to serve in the Congress. That's our first series. So, again, we're working on the Competes Act and lowering cost, and the Competes Act is part of that. Lower families' cost, energize manufacturing, and strengthen America's competitiveness now. And
we were just listening to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi giving her reaction to this historic day. Still with us is Kate Bond, Washington Center for Equitable Growth Director of Labor Markets Policy, and she's also the chief economist there. Kate, thank you as always for joining us. We've been hearing comments from both sides of the aisle simply on their reaction to this historic decision. But let's bring it back to the economics here. We are, after all, Bloomberg Television. And I want to bring the question that I was going to ask before Speaker Pelosi started commenting on the situation. $105 billion annually when it comes to how much this is going to cost state and local governments. I have to ask, though, about the state funding picture. What do we see about the future of state funding and the costs associated with a decision like this?
What we know from economics research is that having a dynamic labor market, having people who can match into jobs that, align with their talents, align with their interests, align with their productive, is good for economic growth overall. And the economics research on access to abortion shows exactly this, that it is a barrier to doing that. So for example, I've done research looking at how targeted restrictions of abortion providers, which are the laws that are explicitly designed to close down abortion clinics in states, lead to women being much less likely to change occupations and in particular go into higher paid occupations. So women who live in these states are 7.6% less likely to go to higher paid occupations. And so what does that mean for overall state budgets and so overall state economic dynamism is if people aren't matching into those jobs where they make more money, they're not going into jobs where they are contributing more to the economy to the best of their ability, that reduces overall economic activity, that reduces overall state budgets. It just really holds back this potential for more economic growth.
Many companies, Kate, are trying to improve their diversity. They're working hard at it. How does this change that effort?
I mean, exactly this. If we have half the population who is facing a barrier in how they match into jobs, it's harder for them to go into different jobs. And so for companies that are looking to be able to recruit from a diverse workforce, there is now a group of workers that is just not going to be able to access those jobs. And so this particularly, of course, for people who can get pregnant, but also we know that reducing access to abortion is particularly hard for women of color. We know that for Black women, for Latina women, not having access to abortion imposes particular economic harms on them. They're less able to get the education they want. They're facing more financial insecurity. And so that means that we are reducing the...
And pitch venture capitalists
and apply for grants to make his vision come to life.
One of the biggest roadblocks to building infrastructure for the internet here in the United States are the existing large providers. They have their land staked out. They would prefer that nobody come in and compete against them. In 2013, we applied for a grant. We went down and met with the commissioners at the California Public Utilities Commission.
Next steps and the economics of it. We're going to bring back Kate as well, but first, your take on what this might cost the United States.
Well, my understanding, and I'm no economist, as you know, my understanding is it's been fairly well established that there's a direct relationship between the plight of the economic situation of women and abortion. We can like that, we can dislike it, but it's, I think, been pretty well established by economists. So this certainly says something, as we were just hearing from Kate Bond, about the situation for women, particularly women at the lower end of the socioeconomic strata, and also women of color. I think there's also the larger question about women in the workforce, because one of the driving forces, as I understand, of growth in the mid-late part of the 20th century in the United States was the addition of women into the workforce. As we all know, growth is driven by the number of people working as well as the productivity. We almost doubled the number of people effectively working. If in fact this takes the participation rate back down for women, what does that mean for economic growth? Whatever you think about the merits of abortion one way or the other, I think that's something we're going to have to contend with. So, Kate, let me ask you that question quite specifically. What would it do if we did lose substantial women participating in the workforce? Quite apart from what it does to the women, and that's no pretty picture, as I understand you've been talking about. What does it do to the overall growth of the economy?
Yeah, and I think you brought up exactly a research point that I would bring up as well. We know since 1980, the single factor that has maintained family incomes, the only reason family incomes have been stable for the last 40 years or so is because women have been able to both work more, so have higher labor force participation, and get into better paying jobs. And I can't overstate that. It is literally the single factor that has led to that. And so we're pulling that back. We are making it less likely that women can go into different occupations where they earn more money. We're making it less likely that women can have the labor force participation that they want to have. And so, what we're risking here, the United States is unique among other advanced economies for having declining female labor force participation since the year 2000. We are risking exacerbating that trend and having a more sluggish economy, distorting our economic growth, obstructing our economic growth by just reducing women's ability both to participate in the first instance and then where they go in the economy in the second instance. I can't overstate it, that this is a huge economic barrier, not just to women, not just to people who get pregnant, not just to the families who are dealing with these immediate and long-term costs, but to the overall economy. When we're pulling back what has been holding up family economic security for the past 40 years.
Kate, a landmark decision like this from the Supreme Court does not put the issue to rest. It just comes back in different guises, even with more litigation yet to come. And I wonder what the political workaround might be here, because a version of what the Supreme Court's decided to say, we're going to put this back in the political sphere with state legislatures, but also there's a federal possible addressing of some of the issues that affect women's participation in the workforce. What are the possible political workarounds that might make up for some of the deficiencies you identify?
I wouldn't guide on specific political workarounds, but I can a couple principles that I think are really important to consider is the need for broad-based federal universal protections for all people, including sort of women who can get pregnant in this instance, because what we have in the United States is a lot of regional economic inequality. There's huge economic inequality between states, between regions, and within states, between urban and rural areas. And the way to address that is not targeted state by state policy per se, not local policy, but raising the universal level across the country of access. And so I would really focus on federally addressing this, ensuring that people across the states and every state have access to the ability to control their own family planning, because we don't want to exacerbate these trends of having certain states where women just perform better, those states perform better, perform worse. Those states have more robust economies or worse economies. We want a national economy that is thriving.
Kate, stick with us. I think we need to continue focusing on that very issue. Kate Bond, joining us from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. David, I know you've got a busy few hours ahead of you, and I know you've got a great deal of preparation that you probably need to do for that. So let me just ask you a quick question before you start that prep. Which states, Kate's talking about the potential difference in economic trajectory for some states here. We've now got the Texas Attorney General saying abortions are now illegal in the state of Texas. Which states are going to find it most difficult to deal with this issue?
I think almost every state is going to have some difficulty dealing with the issue, depending on whether it's dominated by Democrats or Republicans. And I think what we're seeing, and people should check me on this in Texas, as if memory serves, there were more than one state that passed legislation saying if, in fact, the Supreme Court overturns Roe against Wade, then this law kicks in right away. And I suspect Texas is one of those. I think it's not the only one. We'll have several states where it takes effect right away. But then we will have the difficulties of, again, workarounds from both sides, because there will be attempts to make sure women do have access to abortion despite this decision, that is to say, to go outside the state to get access to abortion. What a state like Texas perhaps will do to try to keep them from doing that. There are other states that are going to go well out of their way to make sure that they do have access to abortion and welcome women to come there. And I think there are going to be a lot of questions about enforcement of different statutes, and I wouldn't be surprised if there'd be a fair amount of legislating and litigation that come out of this. As I say, decisions like this at the Supreme Court do not put issues like this to rest at all.
David, I'm so glad you mentioned that question of mobility and moving between state lines, because it's not just a question of perhaps finding an abortion provider in another state that does give those resources, but also other countries as well. What can you tell us about the international implications about what this might mean, women going to other countries to get that kind of access?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I haven't thought much about it, I'll confess to you, but it does raise a broader question, which was true before Roe against Wade in this country. I know that for a fact, that it really breaks down on socioeconomic lines. Because women who can afford an abortion will get an abortion. That happened before Roe versus Wade, when it was banned in so many states. That will happen now as well. The real question is people who can't afford it. I mean, not a lot of people can afford to jump on a plane and fly to Switzerland to have an abortion. Those that can are perfectly free to do so. But what it does do, and this is what Kate Bond was talking about actually, is it really affects the less well off among women. And the question is, what other institutions, whether they're governmental or non-governmental institutions, will do to try to fill that gap, to try to help those women.
David, when you think about what is happening here and you think about the kind of implications for the rest of the world, I'm sitting here in London, I'm watching what is happening here in the United States. I'm watching this potentially incredibly divisive issue galvanize opinion on both sides. And the rest of the world is asking the question as to what does this signal about where America is? Is it leaning left? Is it leaning right? Where is the center of gravity in America right now? And is that center of gravity represented? The rest of the world is trying to understand what this means for their relationship with America and how they should read America right now. How would you answer that question?
Guy, I wish I could give you an encouraging answer. I'm not sure I have one, because I think I could argue easily that it's neither going right nor left, it's just separating. Because as we've talked about before, the majority of Americans are not in favor of banning abortion across the board. They're not. At the same time, there's a very solid, passionate group, plurality, and a significant plurality. Let's be clear, it's not a very small percentage, significant plurality that are against permitting abortion. And on this issue, as by the way, to go back to yesterday, as far as we go as yesterday on guns, there's a big division in the country. And one of my concerns, this is now me editorializing, is I'm not sure when the Supreme Court jumps into a really hotly disputed issue, such as abortion, such as gun control, and decides it as a matter of constitutional law, I'm not sure that brings the country together. And that's the real issue. If I were looking at us from outside, I would be asking not so much are they right, left, but do they have their act together? Are they anywhere? Are they headed in a direction that we can understand, predict, and deal with? So, Kate, let's pick up on that question specifically about what this says about America. I just gave my editorial point of view. What's yours? Are we moving right or left on this? Because there is a significant plurality in the country who will applaud this decision, will it not?
That's true. I mean, I don't know if I want to editorialize what it means politically about the country. I do think there has been a disconnect in the country between policies that would really center economic well-being and policies that are focused on sort of social norms. But the fundamental issue that I see here is that having higher levels of economic well-being is better for everyone, that no matter who someone is, if you're living in a state that has a more dynamic economy, you gain from that. And so it really, social issues aside, is that this is an economic issue at its core, and having a robust economy is good for the entire country. And so I think that has sort of been lost in this message, that people sort of forget that, and I don't want to diminish the moral case here, but people have lost that this is really an economic issue as well. This really affects everyone. This is just an example about having a country with freedom where people can live the lives they want to live is not only a sort of a right and a moral issue, but it is also an economic issue. And limiting that is a detriment to all of us.
Bloomberg's Kate Bond, our Washington Center for Equitable Growth, Director of Labor Market Policy and Chief Economist there. Thank you, as always. And, of course, the thank you to our very own David Westerner, anchor of Balance of Power. He, of course, will continue the special coverage at the top of the hour. We thank you both. Now we go to Washington, D.C. Bloomberg's Joe Matthew is there waiting. Joe, thank you, as always. Give us a little bit of a rundown on what you're seeing on the ground there. It looks like we don't quite have Joe yet, but as we are awaiting him, we can see the images that are on the screen, essentially these massive, massive protests that you are seeing ahead of the Supreme Court. As Anne-Marie Hordern recently pointed out, it is this major move before that you see not only pro-life protesters, but of course those against simply the decision as well. This is really significant. And of course, let's bring in our Bloomberg Washington correspondent here, Anne-Marie Hordern. Anne-Marie, once again, you were the one who pointed out that these protesters, well, they're not just against the decision, they're actually supporting the decision as well. Talk to us about next steps here.
Well, the protesters we've seen really starting to pick up pace since that leaked opinion went to Politico. So as I've said earlier, D.C. has really been on guard in this wait-and-see mode. What day will this opinion come out? And is that draft genuine? Or does that potentially, will it change, or does it really reflect the final decision of the court? And now we know that it does reflect the final decision of the court. You're going to see scenes like this over the course, I can imagine, of the coming days. We already heard from Speaker Pelosi. Of course, we are waiting for him. We do know the president really had a very light schedule today because he is leaving tomorrow. He is preparing for the G7 and the NATO summit. But now we do know that President Biden will be speaking on abortion rights. And when we did have that leaked draft, what we heard from the president was that three really critical things, but the third is what he said, is that the court does overturn Roe. It will fall on our nation's elected officials at all levels of government to protect a woman's right to choose. And it will fall on voters to elect pro-choice officials. And I imagine that will be his message again today.
And of course, we are hearing from other speakers as well. We had Kevin McCarthy speak. We had Chuck Schumer speak. Of course, we took it live. We heard Nancy Pelosi speak. Who else within the congressional arena can we hear from today?
I mean, it's just, the inbox is blowing up today in terms of the statements that are coming out from representatives in the House and senators, because to be an elected official in America, you cannot not have an answer on abortion rights. This is something that individuals go to the polls to elect. There's an interesting one from Senator Manchin because it was also personal. He said that, and he's a moderate swing voter. This is someone we obviously have been tracking because of the economic stories in the United States, but he said he was deeply disappointed the court voted to overturn Roe v. Wade. And to getting a little bit more of his personal story, he said, as a Catholic, I was raised pro-life and will always consider myself pro-life, but I've come to accept that my definition, pro-life, may not be someone else's definition of pro-life. And I believe that exceptions should be made in instances of rape, incest, and the life of the mother is in jeopardy. But let me be clear, I support legislation that would codify the rights Roe v. Wade. Well, they already tried that. The Democrats in May, Schumer tried to put legislation on the Senate floor that would enshrine abortion rights to federal law. It was blocked 49-51. So if the Democrats want to enshrine Roe v. Wade to law, something the president is likely going to talk about like he did in his statement in May, there's going to be a huge rallying cry for Democrats to get out the vote. But at the moment, everyone that is looking at Washington, D.C., the politics of the moment, look and see that the Republicans are really poised to take the House, potentially the Senate, because inflation right now is top of the polls on what matters to Americans. The big question out of today, now that we know that that leaked opinion draft was not just a draft, that reflects the court's decision, and now we have an overturning of Roe v. Wade, will individuals go to the polls and vote on this issue? That's a big question.
It is a big question. Of course, we're going to keep our eye on it. But in the meantime, let's take this international. Anne-Marie, you have reported from all around the world. And if we actually look at this in the context of a bigger picture for our international audience, I'm sure Guy mentioned earlier, he was surprised to see this from sitting in London as well from the outside. It's increasingly important to note that the U.S. is now joining other countries like Poland, El Salvador, Nicaragua, who are also anti-abortion at the moment, but there are several countries around the world who actually have access to broader health care from an economic standpoint. Think France, think the UK as well. Anne-Marie, what does this decision mean for access to health care broadly? Of course, we know in the past we've seen Obamacare, for example, get overturned as well. What does the future look like from a Washington perspective of health care in the United States?
Well, I think for women's reproductive rights and health care in general, this will be incredibly important depending on where you live. Remember, for individuals, say, living in a state like New York, or where I sit in Washington, D.C., will this decision affect me today or other women today? No, it will not, but it will affect women. Say we just had that decision out of Texas. It will affect women that are sitting in Texas. So when you look at health issues in America or reproductive rights in America, it truly depends on where you are sitting. And then it really goes back to the point that David was saying, that if you are affluent and you have the money to do so and the means to do so, you have access to better health care, whether or not it's crossing state lines or getting on a plane and flying to Zurich. But it's those on the most vulnerable, those on the lower economic stature in the United States that are going to find this incredibly troublesome and for many, very scary.
Anne-Marie, stick with us. For now, we are, of course, going to head down to Washington. But before I do that, we are expecting to hear from President Biden delivering remarks on the abortion ruling. It looks like at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, so in a little over an hour. We, of course, will take those when they come and bring you headlines. Until then, joining us now, though, let's head down to Washington, D.C. Bloomberg's Joe Matthew giving us a take from on the ground itself. Joe, what is it like in front of the Supreme Court right now?
This is quite a scene, Creedy. I'm standing right in front of the court here, and there are a couple of thousand people. I wouldn't attempt to count how many are here, but this crowd keeps getting bigger, and you can hear the activity behind me. I just walked away a bit so we could actually hear each other think and talk. But it is definitely a pro-reproductive rights crowd here. There are a few pro-life activists, but those who are streaming in, and they're coming from all over. I'm watching them come down First Street in front of the court here. Some of them are walking around Capitol Hill, all going to the sound of the music. They've got a DJ set up here. Some people are singing songs. There's been a call and response going. A lot of people are yelling in anger, and we're seeing journalists from all over the world, frankly, gather here. Some of the signs that I'm seeing, rise up, abortion rights. Another one, abortion on demand, no apologies. And we've been hearing that refrain go on for some time. So far, though, Creedy, it's important to note that it has been orderly. No shoving, no pushing. The police here, Capitol Police, and ununiformed officers appear at ease. But the day is early, and it's a hot day in Washington here. We're going to keep tabs on what happens for you for the duration.
Joe, put this into some context for us, because, of course, when this opinion was first leaked, we saw a similar kind of response. But I'm curious, is this a larger crowd? Is this a smaller crowd? Is this, to some extent, expected down there?
It is expected. You know, they've had some very high fencing, almost a wall around the court for some time. In fact, they put up the barriers right after that leak of the draft opinion happened. So they've been ready for a lot here. In fact, I'm looking at a large group of officers with vests on coming out of the court who are walking toward the barrier. They're just keeping an eye very closely on what is happening here. The Capitol Police and, of course, the building behind me are part of this as well. And then you've got the D.C. Police. Like I said, there were a couple of hundred people already here before this was released at 10:10 a.m. Washington time, and the crowd just keeps getting bigger. I can't imagine a time when I've seen a larger one here, but sometimes it's dangerous to compare crowd sizes because people are really jammed in together there. It's got the feel of a mosh pit in front of the Supreme Court.
Let's bring back in, I should say, Anne-Marie Hordern here, because Anne-Marie, this is, I mean, a historical decision. Sometimes the words just kind of lose me here, but I'm interested in what this means, or what this kind of reaction might provoke in terms of responses from legislators. We've also already heard from, like you said, Chuck Schumer earlier, Kevin McCarthy, Nancy Pelosi, as well, President Biden to speak at 12:30 as well. But what kind of responses can we hear, perhaps, from the governors of the many states of the United States?
Well, again, it depends what state you're sitting in, right? If you're in a state that has supported this, that was behind, Mississippi and bringing this to the Supreme Court, this is going to be a win. There have been individuals who have been pressing for this for years. Senator Mitch McConnell out with this statement saying it was courageous what the Supreme Court did. He really helped also lay the groundwork for the makeup of what we have right now at the Supreme Court. So for him, this was years in the making of a win for him and his party, who believe that there should have been an overturning of Roe v. Wade. Then you're going to have the likes of very liberal-leaning states, New York, et cetera, that are going to come out and saying what we've heard from many Democrat politicians already saying, that this is basically revoking what many women grew up with and feeling like this is their constitutional right. Speaker Pelosi said that women today have less rights than their mothers. And then when it comes to the president, we do know a little bit about what he's likely going to speak about, and we do have confirmation from our reporting that the White House has confirmed that he will speak at 12:30 p.m. this afternoon. But when that opinion piece was leaked to Politico last month, the president had three things to say. He said, first, his administration argued strongly before the court in defense of Roe v. Wade, and they said that Roe is based on a long line of precedent recognizing the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty. He then said, second, shortly after the enactment of Texas Law SB 8 and other laws restricting women's reproductive rights, he directed his Gender Policy Council and White House counsel's office to prepare options for administrative response. The president will likely come out and talk more about that office as well. And then finally, the president said in this statement, third, if the court does overturn Roe, which they did this morning, it will fall on our nation's elected official at all levels of government to protect a women's rights to choose. And this is going to be the most important thing to watch between now and the midterm elections, because Democrats are going to say, if we want to make this a law of the land, enshrine it in the law, we have to do so by elected officials, because they already tried it in May and they couldn't get it through because they didn't have 60 senators.
Anne-Marie, stick with us. We're going to go back to the ground here and bring in Bloomberg's Joe Matthew, because as we look at this live feed of images here, we are, of course, looking at the pro-life supporters here. They are celebrating, it looks like, the decision from the Supreme Court. Of course, Joe Matthew also mentioned that there were pro-life or pro-abortion, I should say, pro-rights supporters there as well. But Joe, come back on in here and walk us through what you're hearing from simply people on the ground. What kind of sentiment is there? You also mentioned that there were both sides of the story. But talk to us about what you're hearing from your sources on the ground.
Well, there's a lot of anger here. People are very willing, by the way, and looking in many cases to talk to reporters. They're trying to share their views on things. And a lot of these people who arrived since the ruling was announced had no intention or plan to be here. They just kind of dropped what they were doing and came down. Others were clearly up all night making signs and preparing a more organized front here. But it's, frankly, it's a fairly predictable crowd with regard to this issue. Very passionate on both sides. And in some cases, you can hear it, I think, a bit behind me. There's a bit of anger that's coming out here. This is a cathartic moment for both sides, for better and worse. I have seen a couple of pro-life demonstrators here, activists who came down, and they're broadcasting live on their phone, cheering. The couple of women who were doing this drew just a large group of camera crews from news networks to try to get a glimpse of this, because at least on the side of the court that I am on right now, this has been a largely pro-choice event. I'll tell you as well, Creedy, the Capitol Police have rolled in a couple of large buses full of officers, so they are preparing for what could be a long day. I know we'll have to hear from the president, and there's going to be a lot more rhetoric that comes before nightfall here, and police are starting to make preparations for whatever might happen.
Those preparations were exactly where I was going to go next, Joe. Of course, we know that for a very long time, you did have a lot of the more key buildings actually fenced off to some extent in D.C., but I'm curious to what extent those fences come back. Of course, a lot of people, a lot of D.C. residents were celebrating when that fencing had finally come down. I wonder if it comes back up now in light of some of the protests and some of the perhaps anxiousness that might be brewing, as you mentioned.
Yeah, there is, as I mentioned, a very tall barrier that wraps the Supreme Court and the campus that it sits on. There are more like movable barriers, if you will, almost like bike racks that now surround the entire Capitol complex across the street from the Supreme Court. So on the east side here of the Capitol, whether those are replaced...
Hello traders, how are you doing today? It's time to place order to sell short Bitcoin. I'm looking to sell Bitcoin at 21,081. Let me see. Yes, 21,081. Okay, if you're looking to trade Bitcoin, please place your order and wait until you will get filled. Okay. I hope we will get filled quickly. Okay. And let's see. If you want to get the strategy, please go to company.co.uk. You can get the strategy and you can trade on your own. You can learn how to trade, how to day trade, Forex, other securities, indices, all major stocks, Dow Jones or FTSE. Okay, guys, stay safe.
Linked in with reproductive rights. I think this would be based what we heard from a number of companies saying they will support their employees, women who live in states that don't give them the same access to, say, other employees that are living in states that are going to keep broad access to reproductive rights. So again, Kriti, it's really hard to just have a one answer that fits all for all of these questions women are facing in the country as they wake up this morning, because it really, truly depends on where you live in the United States of America today, and you're a woman that is potentially seeking access to reproductive rights. There's a number of other questions that also are affecting women or family planning, men as well. The Wall Street Journal had a great piece on this, which is those that are going through fertility clinics and that they have embryos. Potentially, does this impact those embryos that for family planning in some certain states? So again, there's going to be a slew of questions on so many fronts that individuals, the private sector, companies are going to be dealing with because of this historic decision. And, you know, it really does also beg the question about potentially future decisions. There was almost a nod in this decision. If you read it, it says in future cases, Justice Thomas, we should reconsider all of the court's substantive due process precedents. And he names a number of cases. So you think of things like contraceptive. So there's a ton of questions that need to be answered today. But I think it's really critical to remember that so much of this depends on where you live.
Anne-Marie Hordern, stick with us here. Let's bring back in our very own Tina Davis. She's the executive editor of our legal team. A busy day for you, as always. We appreciate you taking the time. Since we last spoke, and you warned us about this to your credit, that simply some of these trigger laws in the United States could take place very quickly. You warned about Louisiana. Since we last spoke with you, we heard Texas now saying that they are going to overturn some of the abortion legality there as well. But they're not alone. You have a lot of states in the South who do that, as well as Idaho, Wyoming, Utah. The list really just goes on and on. I have to ask you, though, about the timeline of all this. Texas was almost instantaneous. How quickly can we see some of these other state decisions roll out?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would just give as a word of warning there is Texas, the press release from Attorney General Paxton said that Texas has made abortions illegal immediately, but they do still have to wait for what's called the judgment, which is sort of the more formal notice from the Supreme Court. That can take up to a month sometimes, but this is the opinion today, so they do need to wait for the sort of paperwork to come out of the court to formalize this opinion. And the Attorney General of Texas acknowledges that if you sort of read through beyond the press release, there's a whole longer statement about actually some of the more arcane legal machinations that need to happen as well. I suspect that's also going to delay a little bit of the states that are eager to move forward. But, you know, this is there is a chance the Supreme Court could decide to take up a challenge to this. But at this point, you know, it seems pretty clear that this is a 6-3 ruling that's going to stand.
Tina, you're sitting in New York, so I know you have access to a lot of these the private sector, Wall Street. From what I've been hearing from these companies, it's that they want to support women if they're living in states, and that if this ruling was overturned, they would support them financially, getting them mobilely across state lines. Do you see any companies that are actually reversing and moving away from that trend?
We have, I mean, we heard from J.P. Morgan today, and certainly I think the banking industry has been interesting in that we saw action by Citibank as well prior to this, and we're starting to hear a little bit of action from other companies that are dribbling in, including some healthcare companies. I think what's interesting is you'll have to sort of, we are a little bit in a wait and see to sort of see how these companies are reacting. This decision is not a particular surprise to Americans since it was leaked already once before, so everyone had a pretty clear indication that this was a pretty likely possibility. But we are seeing a little bit of movement. I think you'll have to wait as companies try to digest this and try to understand, you know, what they risk in terms of potentially alienating customers or clients by making a stand on this issue.
Tina, I want to echo what Anne-Marie just said, not in terms of the corporate side of this in particular, but once again, let's bring the question to liability and what that actually looks like, not just from banks or from corporations, but perhaps the intermediaries there, the Uber driver, the Lyft driver, the doctor performing the procedure. How does that all work out? Where are the gray areas in that?
Yeah, I mean, this does become a state-by-state battle, right? Because without this constitutional right any longer, you're going to see states try to do various things to stop. And we've already talked to, you know, folks that are talking about, you know, banning travel. In Texas, for example, as you know, there is a law that says you can't aid a person getting an abortion. How will that affect if you're trying to, you know, be a Texas legislature? How can you reach beyond state lines to make sure that none of your citizens leave your state and potentially go to what are called, you know, safe harbor, safe haven states that are looking to be kind of abortion providers for the rest of the nation?
Well, Bloomberg's Tina Davis will stick with us because we have so much more of your brain to pick in this very historic decision here. We are joined now by Jeffrey Stone, the University of Chicago Law School professor. Jeffrey, thank you for joining us. And like I said, is a historic moment here. Walk us through simply the legality here as we start to see the trickle-down effect from the federal level to the state level. We did get some context here from Tina about simply the timeline of what that might look like. But what kind of hurdles do some of these states now have to deal with?
Well, I think that they basically have a pretty much open invitation now to prohibit abortion, absolutely, except in possibly cases of rape or incest, and that many of them will do so. And I don't think the court is going to interfere with any of that.
Jeffrey, also, let's talk about the corporate side of it as well. We just posed the question to Tina, and Tina said it's focused really by a state-by-state question. The legality here of employers who want to actually support their women in the workplace, including their access to abortion, whether that's within the borders of the United States or even abroad. What kind of liability do they expose themselves to?
Well, that depends on state law. The states can prohibit anyone from having an abortion or assisting a person in having an abortion, and corporations are not immune from that. In states where abortion is still legal and will continue to be legal, they will have the freedom to help their employees and others in any way they wish. But in the states that prohibit abortion, there's not a whole lot they can do. Presumably, they can help their employees go to states where abortion is legal. And that would be, I think, a very sensible thing for them to do. And it would make it very appealing to many employees. But I think that's probably the best thing that they could do.
Professor Stone, I want to ask you, given we have this ruling now overturning of Roe v. Wade, are you expecting this court, 6-3, that's obviously leaning conservative, to overturn other potential past precedents like same-sex marriage, contraceptives? Are these concerns or questions potentially that you're hearing from people?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't call it the court that's leaning conservative. It is the most extremely conservative court possibly in American history. And that's not only about issues of abortion, but as we've seen, issues of gun rights, issues of religion, and this is likely to continue across a broad range of questions. These justices are, quite frankly, far more conservative than their predecessors. Indeed, of the Republican-appointed justices who served on the court, apart from the ones currently on the court, beginning with Roe, almost all of them, except for two, Rehnquist and Scalia, upheld the right to abortion. And now we've got 6 Republican appointees, all of whom are prepared to overrule Roe in an aggressive way. So this is a court that should not be regarded as in any way leaning conservative. It is absolutely extreme, and we've seen that this week in 3 decisions that are quite extraordinary, the abortion one being the most dramatic. So I don't expect them to be moderate about any of these issues. Whether they will overrule the decisions about contraception and same-sex marriage and so on, the basic approach they have taken here would suggest that they would overrule them as a matter of, quote, principle, although I don't think there's much principle involved in this. But they may want to limit their controversiality to abortion, which they probably regard as the most inflammatory of the 3 issues. And also, the vast majority of Americans now clearly support a right to contraception and even a right to same-sex marriage. So I think those would be even much more unpopular decisions. Alito, in his draft opinion, basically suggested that the way he would distinguish those issues is that those issues do not involve a competing interest equivalent to the life of an unborn fetus. And therefore, the court would be more likely to be deferential to precedent in those areas than it would be in the abortion area. But whether that's a real observation on his part or just a momentary excuse remains to be seen.
So obviously now, so much of this depends on where you live, right? It's really the state's rights to decide on so much of this. When you look at the different state legislators, can you just paint us a picture of where you think this is going to be? You're going to see some of the harsh measures play out in terms of outright bans on abortion?
Well, it's mostly the southern states, particularly those who were in the Confederacy, and some states in the West. But they're pretty predictable at this point because those states, roughly 20 of them or so, have adopted laws that are unconstitutional until now, designed to prohibit abortion. And it's pretty clear which states those will be. There's some states where it's not completely clear what will happen, states like Indiana and Michigan, for example. But for the most part, the country is pretty clear about which states will continue to protect abortion as a matter of state law, like New York, California, Illinois, and so on. And those states which will definitely outlaw abortion, like Florida, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Wyoming, and those states which are not clear, like, as I said, Michigan and Indiana.
Given those are the state laws, and I'm just, we're gearing up to hear from the president in under an hour's time, and I'm looking back at a past statement when he had the opinion draft that was leaked to Politico. He said that if there was to become law, and soon also after other laws restricting women's reproductive rights, like in Texas, as you mentioned, he directed his Gender Policy Council and White House Counsel Office to prepare options for administrative response to continue attack on abortion and reproductive rights. What could the federal government do if it wanted to help women in these states?
Well, the federal government could enact, in theory, a federal law that protected the right of women to exercise the right to abortion, not as a constitution.
Okay, guys, as you can see, it's moved down instead of up the price. So let's cancel for time being in order to sell short Bitcoin. Let's see what's going to happen. Yeah, and if it will move up, we will re-enter order to sell short Bitcoin. Okay, guys, stay safe.
one thing they could do. Other than that, they could provide health care for women who do need abortions. And in theory, they could provide funding for women who live in states that do not allow abortion to enable them to go to states that do allow abortion, particularly for poor women who can now afford that. But again, all that depends on how aggressive these justices will be in allowing the government to do those things. But because the states are willing to do it, are able to do it, it's arguably the case that the federal government could do that as well.
Professor, you very notably in 2013 interviewed the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on this very ruling, the Roe v. Wade, and she was very forthcoming in terms of her criticism for it, the way this law was actually crafted, saying that Roe isn't really about the women's choice, is it? It's about the doctor's freedom to practice. It wasn't women-centered, it was physician-centered. I'm curious, in your expert opinion, what recrafting the law to adjust those intricacies might look like.
Well, first of all, I disagree with her characterization. It's true that Blackmun's opinion talks a little bit about doctors being able to provide health care, but fundamentally it's about the rights of women. But in the context of privacy, of the right of individuals to control their own destiny on fundamental personal decisions, like whether to have children. If the state said everybody must have 2 children, presumably the court would hold that unconstitutional. It's violating the right of autonomy of individuals not to have children. And that was fundamentally what the decision in Roe was about. The right of women to make this decision for themselves. It's such a fundamental decision in terms of their lives. And so I disagree with Ginsburg about it being about doctors as opposed to about women, although there was talk about doctors as well. And so I think that mischaracterizes the decision. I think fundamentally, I was a law clerk at the Supreme Court for Justice Brennan when Roe v. Wade was decided. And I can honestly say that almost no one working at the court at that time thought it was about the right of doctors. They thought it was about the privacy and autonomy rights of individuals, similar to the right not to have children, the right to have abortions.
Jeffrey Stone, University of Chicago Law School professor. We thank you all as always for that historical insight and of course your professionalism as always. We really appreciate it. Let's pivot here and bring in Andy Blocker, Invesco Global Head of Public Policy and Head of U.S. Government Affairs. Andy, thank you as always for joining us on this historic day. Walk us through first your reaction and your take on the ripple effects here.
So it's too early to tell the ripple effects, but I will say this, is that we don't really see a change in the macro political environment right now. The key issues remain inflation and the economy. Those are what's going to drive voters in the polls in November. And I think that I'm not sure this changes the calculation of the House of Representatives. However, we've shown that while before the leak of the decision some months ago, we saw about 6% of voters being driven by abortion. Since the leak, that's increased to around 20%. And the key is, does that hold or increase? And is this a driving factor in some key states? That's the initial assessment that we have on that.
Andy, stick with us. I want to bring back in Tina Davis, our executive editor of Legal, and of course has her hands full on this historic decision. We thank you as always for staying with us and making the time. In terms of the ripple effects here, I'm going to pose the same question I just gave Andy. What are the ripple effects here? What is at the top of the list?
Well, I think Anne-Marie referenced the dissent a little bit of time ago, and it's very interesting because the liberal justices were very aware and very afraid in that dissent that this is going to be used for other precedents. She mentioned contraceptives, gay marriage, also potentially rulings against anti-sodomy laws. Basically, the way to sort of say that if there is no right to privacy enshrined in the Constitution, then what else can the government do in terms of how you interact, how you use your body, et cetera. What is interesting is we saw a concurring opinion from Justice Thomas that speaks to this issue quite clearly. And as you know, the ruling on the Mississippi was 6-3, so it had all the conservatives, and the ruling on abortion was 5-4, much more narrow. But what's interesting is you see in his concurring opinion that Justice Thomas basically openly says we should be looking at all of these things. There is precedent for these laws, and as was pointed out, this is almost a 50-year-old law, Roe v. Wade. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't overturn these things. And I think that is going to draw a lot of attention. It's going to make abortion rights groups very, very afraid, and other groups, that this will have ripple effects way beyond simply a woman's right to an abortion, and may affect, everything to do with, LGBTQ issues, any sort of equality rulings that the Supreme Court has made in the past.
And what kind of timeline can we expect on that? I mean, is this a process that might take years, decades, months? How quickly does it go?
Well, look, the one thing you can take away from this is that Thomas wrote this concurring opinion on his own, right? So he didn't have a full majority that sort of believed, as he does, that this should have wider ramifications. And in fact, as the professor pointed out a little while ago, Alito specifically says this does not have broader ramifications on those particular cases. So it really does depend if Thomas is able to get more of the conservative justices on his side, there may be an ability for any case that comes up to the Supreme Court to challenge any of those prior rulings.
Andy, let me bring you back into the conversation here. I mean, you just heard Tina talk about the potential ripple effects. I'm curious about the impacts on the midterm elections in particular. This is a heavy watched event for our international audience in November that we are, of course, going to get more insight in terms of the majority that happens in Congress. Andy, the implications on the midterms.
Yeah, so like I was saying before about the midterms, I think the key here is what kind of, does it have a large macro impact, which I'm not sure it will, because between now and November, there are other issues like inflation, which are top of mind for people. However, I do believe it can have a significant impact on specific states that are in play, whether it's Nevada or New Hampshire or Arizona, where these issues can become top of mind, and it's really about turnout. So the question is, okay, people may be upset, people may be reacting now, but the question is, will that actually materialize in votes in November? And I think that's the key thing we're looking at.
Well, votes in November, but I also have to ask, Andy, we're looking at a historic kind of return from COVID in terms of a labor force getting back to work, an extremely tight labor market that we're seeing, which women are actually the laggards in terms of rejoining. A lot of that has to do with simply childcare. Now, in light of this kind of decision, what expectation can we have on the impact on the labor market and simply those jobs that matter so much to the economy right now?
Yeah, I think it's too early to tell specific with this decision on those far-reaching implications. I think you're right to talk about childcare and access to childcare and the ability to actually go back in office. So far, a lot of firms are still having some flexibilities, others aren't. So I think from the abortion decision, I'm not sure we can reach that conclusion because it's going to take some time to go through the state courts and what that is, and I can't reach that far out. But in the more immediate future, I do think politically, there's going to be a reaction. In physics, we talk about for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. But in politics, for every action, there's a disproportionate and unequal reaction. And you're going to see that politically, and you're going to see Democrats try to take advantage of that.
Andy, I'll give you one more question here. I'm curious simply about the implications for state and federal relationships here. If the decision is ultimately, the authority, I should say, is going perhaps not from the Supreme Court, but to the state level, what does that do in terms of the relationship between the federal level and the state level, and what implications does that have on, say, funding going from federal to state?
Yeah, so I think it's going to rejigger what the expectation is at the federal level on laws in this area versus what the expectation is on the state level, because the Supreme Court is basically saying these are decisions for the states in general. I mean, I haven't done the full legal analysis of that. Seems the direction they've moved. And so it's going to be a lot of the efforts for groups lobbying on this issue on both sides will be focused much more on the state side, because that's where the Supreme Court has basically said those are where the decision is going to be made.
Tina, let's bring you back in here and talk simply. I mean, we talked about the funding part of it. We talked about the ripple effects, but I'm curious in terms of recrafting some of this legislation. There will surely be attempts by the folks who are perhaps looking to, in some ways, appeal this decision or in some ways recreate new law. What kind of steps do they have to take? What kind of holes or hurdles do they have to face?
Well, look, you have to, first of all, find a good case. I always think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, bringing an equality case that had to do with a man not being able to get benefits from his wife. Right. So you have to kind of find a case that you think speaks to the Supreme Court, to their sort of leanings, that brings up the issues that you want addressed, you know, you need a good plaintiff and a good defendant to actually sort of make it all the way through, and you have to have the resources to do that. Now, on the resources question, I think, as has been touched upon several times here already, you know, there's going to be no shortage of resources thrown at this issue. You know, the anti-abortion groups spent decades trying to get this ruling overturned. Today is the culmination of all of that effort and all of that time and money spent. I think you're now going to see, as the last speaker just pointed out, and probably an equal and opposite and maybe even a louder reaction from groups that want to see exactly the other opinion and want to see this opinion rejected ultimately. So this is going to take a long time. This is not something that happens, you know, in the legal world. A long time is a very long time. So This is not something that moves quickly in any case. But you will be seeing, you know, groups looking for that kind of perfect plaintiff, perfect case that tees up the issue, that allows the case, allows the court rather, to relook at this issue perhaps in a new way.
A very long time in terms of legal processions, almost by purpose, almost like it's by design. Bloomberg's Tina Davis, our executive editor for our legal team, and Andy Blocker of Invesco, we thank you both so much for your time on this historic day. Let's now go back to Washington here and get an on-the-ground look with our very own Joe Matthew. Joe, give us the update from what you're seeing.
Just a slowly growing crowd, Creedy. That's been the story since I got here shortly after the ruling was announced, and there were already several hundred people in front of the court. There's a lot of yelling. I moved away just a little bit here so we could hear each other talk, but it's a lot of megaphones, a lot of call and response. There was singing earlier. Someone's even blowing bubbles into the crowd at this point. It kind of oscillates between celebration and anger, depending on whether pro-choice activists or pro-life activists are making more noise at the time. As we've reported, though, there is quite a police presence here. Security is a big deal here in the area between the Supreme Court and the U.S. Capitol. There are Capitol Police, there are D.C. police, and there are ununiformed officers who are making their way around as well. The police at the Supreme Court have lined the inside of the barrier that's been set up, a very tall barrier that now goes all the way around the court. It's been there since the opinion draft first leaked, and it doesn't look like they'll be taking that down anytime soon, Grady.
Joe, about 30 seconds here, very quickly. The security for the Supreme Court justices, can you give us an update?
They have been in place. In fact, this was something that had been dealt with already through legislation. We haven't heard any reports of any malfeasance, but they are at the homes of each justice right now, making sure that it stays that way, Creedy.
To our very own Bloomberg's Joe Matthew, giving us on the ground reports, I should say, throughout the rest of the day. We thank you as always. And on this historic day where we do, of course, have the Supreme Court decision overturned, we're going to continue our coverage with a special edition of Balance of Power, simulcast on both Bloomberg Television and radio with our very own David Weston. He's going to tackle this issue from the politics, from the economics, and of course the legality of it all. What does it mean for some of these states? What does it mean for the economics? And of course, what does it mean not just for the women's reproductive rights, but for the costs associated as well? This was Bloomberg Markets. This is Bloomberg.
Every art institution I know of wants you to serve on their board, and you're very involved in the art world. What is it about art that attracts you?
Well, art is essential in a democracy, David. Art is so important. We know what art does to young people. We know that exposure to art brings about higher levels of empathy. It helps people understand how other cultures, other people live. And it just brings out the kind of humanity in all of us. There are times when I have observed leaders use language that is inhumane while talking about other human beings, while talking about the world. And I think to myself, this person has clearly never engaged in beautiful poetry. They've never listened to the words of a great playwright. They've never sat and reflected on a beautiful painting or picture. Because if they had been really educated, had they really been exposed to the arts, they wouldn't find it possible to use this kind of language.
You will shed light on dark matter. You will make aging optional. Because when you subscribe to Bloomberg, you won't just get news. You will get insight into limitless possibilities. Before you change the world, Bloomberg.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. It is an historic day in the United States of America. The Supreme Court did what many thought might be unthinkable, which is they overturned over 50 years of precedent in Roe versus Wade, as well as Casey this morning, with far-reaching implications certainly for individual rights, but also potentially for the economy and for business as well. To start off with opinion itself, we turn now to our Supreme Court reporter. He is, of course, Greg Stohr in Washington. So, Greg, take us through exactly what happened here.
What happened was basically the draft leaked opinion that we saw a month and a half ago. Justice Sam Alito for the court, for 5 justices, said that Roe versus Wade was egregiously wrong, was not based in the country's history or traditions, and they voted to overturn that ruling. Chief Justice John Roberts joined the court in upholding the law before them, a 15-week ban in Mississippi, but he said he wouldn't have taken that last step.
So, as you know so well, Greg, from your vast experience in the Supreme Court, typically these major decisions are not the last word in it. It actually often foments more litigation. What's the next question coming up? Is there any anticipation what the next challenge will be?
There will be all manner of next questions. The court gave us some clues about some of them. So, for starters, what does this mean for other rights? Justice Alito said it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't affect same-sex marriage. It doesn't affect contraceptive rights. He said abortion is different because we're talking about a potential fetal life here. The dissenters are very skeptical of that. They are worried about where the court will go next. There are also some abortion-related questions that we'll see. One of those is, can a state bar somebody from traveling to another state to have an abortion? There have been proposals to do that. Justice Kavanaugh, in what could be a key concurring opinion, said that in his view, a state cannot do that. And that might be enough to doom those sorts of laws. But there will certainly be many, many other questions that come along.
Okay, we'll be coming back to you on each and every one of them. Thank you so much to Greg Stohr. He is Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter. Now, to get a sense of what's going on actually at the Supreme Court itself, we turn to our Bloomberg Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew. He's the host, of course, of Sound On weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. Joe, thank you so much. You're up at the Supreme Court. Give us a sense of what's going on up there.
It's been quite a rambunctious scene here, David. It started before, in fact, the ruling was even announced. Several hundred people had gathered outside, activists on both sides of this issue, and the crowd has been building ever since. We've been here now for some time, and it looks like a couple of thousand people, in fact, are gathered in front of the Supreme Court. And as you might remember, they erected a large barrier around the Supreme Court, much like we saw around the Capitol following January 6th. As soon as that opinion draft was leaked. The barriers remain, but the police presence here is significant. Capitol Police, D.C. Police, and other agencies have even been bussed in here in some cases in terms of the U.S. Capitol Police to try to keep things under control, and so far they have been. But the people, David, behind me who have gathered in front of this court today represent the front lines of this issue, pro-life and pro-choice. We've heard a lot of yelling. We haven't seen any shoving. We haven't seen any fighting break out, but a lot of signs and a lot of passion here today, David.
Joe, I don't want to extrapolate too much from this, but perhaps just for a moment, you make a very important point. It's not just demonstrating on one side, and that's something we've seen pretty much since Roe versus Wade was first decided. It was a divisive issue then, and it remains a very divisive issue today. Although a majority of Americans may be in favor of permitting some form of abortion, it's a substantial plurality who are against it.
That's absolutely right, and they are represented here today as well. You might be seeing and hearing a bit more at the moment from pro-choice activists who have been streaming in here from all directions, David. Right in front of me is the U.S. Capitol, the Supreme Court behind me, and there have been bike racks set up all around this area to try to control crowds, so they're streaming in through some very narrow areas. But we've seen everything from celebration to tears on both sides today as people kind of exercise their emotions and sort of bring the passion here. The question is, what's the president going to say a little bit later, knowing that we heard earlier today that Gallup shows confidence in the U.S. Supreme Court among Americans has fallen to a more than 50-year low, David?
Yeah, Joe makes such an important point. We do expect to hear from the President of the United States, Joe Biden, at about 12:30 Eastern Time. But before that, we're supposed to hear from Kevin McCarthy. He's the House Minority Leader. We'll bring you both of those as they occur. Joe, thank you so much. That's Bloomberg's Joe Matthew. Once again, host of Sound On. You can listen to him tonight at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. And now we want to turn to some of the politics of all this. And for that, we turn to our political contributors. It's Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shan Zeno of Iona College. So, Jeannie, I'll start with you. As I said in the open, there was a time that we thought it would be unthinkable this would happen. Well, that has happened.
It has, and even though we had the draft opinion and most people thought this was coming down the pike, I have to say myself, working through this decision, it is a bit eerie to see it now in black and white. And I am still working through the decision, but one of the things that's very striking as you look at, for instance, Clarence Thomas's concurrence in this, he does raise questions about some of these issues that Greg was talking about, same-sex marriage, contraception, and the like. He says we weren't asked to decide those today, but, if we were, we'd have to revisit that. Now, they don't have the votes at this point for that, but that is the concern you're hearing, particularly on the left, that this is something of a slippery slope. It was this right today, and in the future with this conservative court, something else could fall. And I think we're going to hear more of that as we move into the midterm and the 24 election.
And Rick, let's pick up on that. If we look at the more right of center part of the country, if I can put it that way, are they going to say we should be careful about going further? Or in fact, is this just going to be a bit in their teeth as a practical matter in some of these, particularly state legislatures that are controlled by Republicans?
Well, these state legislators, as you mentioned, have been legislating on these things for quite some time, right? They're passing trigger laws in advance of a decision like this around Roe. They're putting limitations on abortion access all the time. They are litigating cultural war issues like gay marriage and other issues all the time. So this is actually the normal course. What this does is give them a shot in the arm that they can actually legislate in these areas and actually know that they're not going to be found unconstitutional when it gets to the Supreme Court.
Rick, not to put too fine a point on it, does this mean anything for the midterms, do you think?
Sure. I think that it's all about intensity. Who's going to show up on in November of 2022? And I think that there could be an argument either way, right? I mean, this is a huge plus for the pro-life Republican supporters out there. They're going to want to do a victory lap. They're going to want their people in powerful positions so that nothing can get done in Congress to overturn this. And of course, it's going to electrify the pro-life, pro-choice community because now they have had something taken away, right? And they're on defense. And they're going to be angry, and they're going to want to do something about it. And this ballot box is really the only thing they can do about it within the next 6 months.
Okay, thank you so much. And we're going to be going back to Jeannie Shan Zeno and Rick Davis throughout this 2-hour special coverage of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Coming up, we're going to talk about today's Supreme Court decision with former head of Planned Parenthood, Gloria Felt. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
When you think of cutting-edge technology at sea, you might be thinking of stuff like this. But there's an incoming revolution on the high seas that isn't quite as sexy, but could be significantly more impactful.
Container shipping is the key component of global trade. About 80 or 90% of all the world's goods are transported at sea at some point.
But there's a significant unseen cost to the modern era of global commerce.
About 3% of all the world's CO2 emissions come from shipping.
3% may not sound like a lot, but that's roughly comparable to the entire CO2 output of Germany. Since reducing trade isn't a likely option, what about a technological improvement to help reduce the emissions from these well-stocked maritime behemoths?
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We are having two special coverage on Balance of Power today of that overturning of Roe versus Wade, and we should be hearing from the House Minority Leader shortly. He is Kevin McCarthy of California. We'll bring you that when that happens. In the meantime, we want to turn to Gloria Feldt. She's the former CEO of Planned Parenthood and the current president of Take the Lead, a nonprofit dedicated to achieving gender equity. So thank you so much, Gloria, for being with us. Give us a sense of what you think the practical effects will be for women, and even more broadly for the workforce of this decision.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me. The Balance of Power, the name of this program, is exactly the correct framing for this issue, because this decision is not about abortion. It is about power and patriarchal control over women, especially having a negative impact on poor women who can't travel to other states or other countries, and people of color for whom these consequences will fall most harshly. There is no doubt of that, because we've seen that before. Some of us remember before. And so the next steps have to be that literally we start over again, creating a new jurisprudence, a new legislative basis for women's civil and human rights to make their own childbearing decisions. You, I think, mentioned that there is conversation in the opinion, which I haven't read fully yet, but I have been saying for years that if abortion is overturned, then so is the right to contraception, so are LGBTQ rights, including marriage equality and many other rights of that are not explicitly named in the Constitution, but that have been affirmed by prior courts. And so what we need to understand is that all civil rights are under threat. So it's not just women who will suffer, it is women, their families, and also it is an economic issue as well. You know, there is not a woman who is in an executive position right now who could have been there 100 years ago, both because of law, but also because there was no way for women to reliably be able to plan and space their childbearing. Well, now there is. And it is huge. It will have huge implications, economic implications for families and for companies.
Gloria, take us back through history, if you would, a bit. Not that you were there for it. I'm old enough to be. You're not. But one of the things that strikes me is it's 50 years now since Roe versus Wade, and yet the country did not come together behind that decision. Unlike, for example, Brown versus Board of Education. 50 years after Brown versus Board of Education, everybody was pretty agreed it was the right decision. That didn't happen here. Why was that? It still seems to be just as divisive as it was on day one.
I have been here for quite a bit of it, David, and but I will go back even further to 1873, when the first laws were passed outlawing contraception, the Comstock laws. It took 100 years from that time till 1973, when Roe was decided by the United States Supreme Court. So it has been a long trajectory And the reason it has taken so long and the reason there has been such pushback against it is precisely because the move toward gender equality is, because it affects every single one of us, it is the most, is the most radical, as it were, movement for social justice in the country and really on the face of the earth. And for women to become first-class citizens, not second-class citizens, the first thing you have to be able to do is to determine whether, when, and with whom to have children, to have authority over your own bodies. So that's why I said at the beginning, understand this issue is not about abortion per se. It is about power and who will wield it, how they will wield it, and over whom.
And Gloria, taking your notion of sort of a battle, a tug of war over gender equity in this country, one of the things the Supreme Court did today, I dare say, was move it more into the political branches, away from the courts. What possible actions could be taken by the political branches to try to address some of the downsides you identify?
We don't know yet what this particular court would do if there were federal legislation, but that's the first thing that needs to happen. And when I was president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, we wrote a piece of legislation that essentially codifies not just Roe, but codifies the right to make our own childbearing decisions, and that's the language of it, without government interference, as a human right, as a civil right. Not just as a gender issue, but literally as a civil and human rights issue. So that is the first thing that needs to happen, not merely protecting clinics, not merely protecting women. Those are very important things to do. But we need to have a core conversation in this country about, is a woman a citizen? Did Abigail Adams, you may recall, asked her husband John when he was writing the Constitution to remember the ladies, and he didn't. He made fun of her, and we're still suffering from that even now. America has not come to grips ever with making women full and equal citizens, and that's where we have to go. That is why I say, you know, the fact that Roe was cleanly overturned might end up giving us that opportunity to have that important conversation and to build an entirely new jurisprudence of reproductive rights.
It's a really terrific perspective to have. Thank you for sharing with us. That's Gloria Feldt, former head of Planned Parenthood. Coming up, more on the Supreme Court's decision. We're going to speak with Minnesota Senator Tina Smith. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
In my new film, I'm creating a lot of transmutants, but I think this is the era coming in. We are mutating ourselves.
It could be so amazing if we were to biohack with care.
Because of the biotechnology has advanced to this state, the big thing is actually changing your whole body construct.
Hyundai Motor, connecting art and technology.
Joel, since Kansas, we've taken our own path. We've never done what everyone else did. We took on the fear. We ignored the doubt. We loved the excitement. We believed. Even when our path didn't make sense to everyone else, we kept going. We keep going until our path is the one they wish they had taken.
What if you could put aside your doubts and look to retirement with excitement? What if you could be more adventurous because your savings had some protection? At Bright House Financial, we specialize in annuities and life insurance that help protect what you've earned and ensure it lasts.
Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
It's a great question. Great question. Great question.
Great question.
Great question.
That's going to be the best question I get all night.
I'm glad you asked that.
Bloomberg Television. Top experts. Great questions.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Justin. We have 2 hours of special coverage of this decision from the Supreme Court today, overturning Roe against Wade, as well as Casey against Planned Parenthood. And to continue that coverage, we turn now to Senator Tina Smith. She's Democrat of Minnesota. Senator, thank you so much for being with us. To some extent, what the Supreme Court did today was say, you know what, the courts aren't going to have the rules here. We're going to have more of the political entities do it, both state and federal. Give us a sense of what is doable politically in response to this decision.
Well, I think what the court said was very dramatically that 50 years of precedent in the United States Supreme Court don't matter, and that actually we don't believe that the right to abortion, the freedom to make decisions about your own life in this way is guaranteed by the Constitution. And as you say, then what that means is that it pushes it back to state legislatures all across the country. I can't think of another example where the court has said this fundamental freedom is going to be determined based on where you live in this country, which is now the reality that American women are going to be facing. And of course, across the country, there are trigger laws in place. What that means is a law that says as soon as Roe versus Wade is overturned, which it has been as of today, the right to abortion is gone in this state. I think about 26 states, people's right to access to abortion care will be either dramatically reduced or gone altogether. So this is going to create a crisis for women all across the country. And it'll also create a crisis for states where abortion will still be legal as folks try to figure out how to get access to the care that they need so that they have control over their own lives.
Let's talk about the Congress first, where you serve up there. There are people now calling for federal legislation to reinstate the protections of Roe versus Wade. Let's be honest, it might be something you would like, but is there any realistic prospect of that?
No, there isn't. In the United States Senate, as you know, you have to have 60, not 51, but 60 people to go along with any piece of legislation that passes, and we don't have 60 people in the Senate. It's also important to know that the Republican Party and the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate has said that he believes that the idea of a national ban on abortion would be on the table if Republicans were in control of the Senate. So you're right. The debate over abortion and who gets to decide will continue in Congress, even as it gets played out in hundreds of different ways in state legislatures around the country.
When you talk about a possible ban on abortion, and we did hear, I think it was Mitch McConnell talked about it, wasn't it? As a practical matter, does the filibuster rule that has really defeated some efforts from the Democrats turn around the other way, assuming, in fact, they get a majority, but it's not enough to beat the filibuster?
Well, I think that that's true under the rules of the Senate as they stand right now. There would not be, depending on who's in the Senate and all of the ins and outs of our process, I think that that's true. But I think it's really important for people to understand this is a fundamental difference between the two parties in our country. And I think that there's just no doubt that my party is much more aligned with where Americans are. Americans believe that it should be people and not government who decide.
Senator Smith, it was so wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much. That's Tina Smith from Minnesota. We're going to go now to Capitol Hill, where the minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, is speaking.
The people have won a victory. The right to life has been vindicated. The voiceless will finally have a voice. This great nation can now live up to its core principle that all are created equal, not born equal, created equal. Americans celebrate this historic victory because we know it will save the lives of millions of children and it will give families hope. But as encouraging as today's decision is, our work is far from done. Americans remain one of only 7 countries on earth that allow elective abortions in the 3rd trimester. Of those 7 countries that America's one of them, there's 2 others, China and North Korea. That is radical. The House Democrats continue to support it against the wishes of the American people. This Congress, every House Democrat has voted for extreme policies, like taxpayer-funded abortion on demand until the point of birth. But Democrats' radical agenda does not have America's support. To the contrary, America rejects it because they remain committed to our values and our principles. The Supreme Court was not bullied by the far-left mob. Threats of violence against the justices did not win. And the truth is, pro-life Americans are not planning a night of rage. The reaction to this principled decision by the court, it must be peaceful. And the DOJ must step up to protect our justices, their families, churches, and pro-life pregnancy centers from unprovoked violence. To the DOJ, do not be silent. Do not stand back, and uphold the rule of law. We live in a country that is based on the dignity of all human life. With that, we'll take some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Leader McCarthy, Justice Thomas, as part of this ruling, has said that he wants to revisit things like the Supreme Court's decision on gay marriage and contraception. What do you all say to that?
The Supreme Court is a different branch of government. They can look at whatever comes before them. I just know in what we are doing and what we have today is that life matters.
Would you
that for so many years, life has stood up.
But would you all support
Yes,
those
ma'am.
decisions being revisited?
The Supreme Court is a separate branch of government. They take their positions, yes.
If you were Speaker and House Republicans win the majority, what are some of the abortion bills that you would put on the floor?
Well, first and foremost, I believe in saving every life possible. Look at what we have done. Hyde Amendment, but more importantly, look at what the Democrats have done. For decades, that was a bipartisan position. Why did this new radical agenda, when the Democrats took the House, the Senate, and the White House, even the President Biden, who had supported that, removed that? You look at Ann Wagner's bill. And when you look at what we can do, we will continue to look wherever we can go to save as many lives as possible.
So you would put Ann Wagner's
yes.
bill on the floor?
Leader, you touched on this a little bit, but current laws are still in place right now where the Attorney General is just not doing anything about it in plain politics. What would you want to tell him specifically?
I would tell him in less than 140 days, things are going to change here. And he will have now a Congress that will call him up. He will now have the ability of a Congress to have oversight. He will now have a Congress that will hold him accountable. Thank you all, and most importantly, to America. I continue to pray, one, for the safety of everyone, but more importantly, we now have a voice for all life. Thank you, and God bless.
And that was House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Republican of California, at a news conference attended by quite a few other members of his leadership there on House of Representatives, applauding the decision of the Supreme Court earlier today to overturn Roe against Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthoods, referring to what the Democrats had done for many years as what he called a radical agenda that now is going to be overturned, and also warning the Attorney General to make sure that they protect it against possible violence and demonstrations against what has been done. Saying that in 140 days that there's going to be a new sheriff in town. At least they're going to have, he thinks, a majority in the House, and they will hold Merrick Garland to account. For a summary now of where we are, we turn now to our Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew. He is, of course, the host of Sound On every day of the week at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. He's up at the Supreme Court of the United States. So what is the agenda of the Republicans now? Do they want more legislation on abortion? Is that what we were hearing from Mr. McCarthy?
We didn't get much of an answer on that, at least not in terms of specifics there, David, but interesting, he did talk about the effort to save every life possible and condemned the Democrats for what he called their support for abortion on demand. There could well be continued legislation that comes from what would be a Republican-led House, assuming they take the majority. Our own Greg Storr, the Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter, in fact, was talking about the possibility of legislation that might control women's ability to travel outside of states that ban abortion to those that have legalized it. One of the things he pointed out, interestingly, David, he said pro-life activists are not predicting a night of rage. That's not something that's gotten a lot of coverage, but it's been getting a lot of talk here in the nation's capital, with activists promising what they've called a night of rage or a purge if, in fact, this ruling came down as it did. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked about that just in the last week or so, and the White House condemned any action of violence or vandalism that might follow this ruling. It's something, David, that law enforcement are keenly aware of as we head into the evening hours here later today in Washington.
And Kevin McCarthy specifically called out the need to make sure we protect the justices themselves, as we have had some threats against just even that one individual who got fairly close to one justice's house. At the same time, I was struck by the fact that Mr. McCarthy was asked specifically about things like same-sex marriage and contraception, and he would not touch it with a 10-foot pole, to use a legal phrase.
That's very true, and that's been consistent since the draft first leaked. That has been a refrain that we've heard from Speaker Nancy Pelosi, saying this is just the beginning. This is the opening stage in what could be a much wider crackdown on liberties, as they've pointed to same-sex marriage, to your point, among others. But Kevin McCarthy's been very careful about this. This is a very delicate issue that's going to resonate on the campaign trail, no matter what lawmakers say, and they want to try to channel that energy to their benefit the best they can.
Okay, thank you so much once again to our very own Joe Matthew. He's the host of Sound On every day of the week at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. You're going to want to hear that on Bloomberg Radio, but before that, we'll have Joe back on here. Now let's turn back to our Bloomberg political contributors, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. So Jeannie, I didn't get a chance to ask you actually what Joe was just talking about. Is this going to make a difference on the campaign trail come the midterms, Jeannie?
You know, I think it will. I don't think that something like the import that people place on the economy and inflation is going to be superseded by this. But I do think if this turns out to be a base election, as many midterms are, this could play a role. But I think the role I would watch for is particularly at the state level. You know, in your home state of Michigan, for instance, in states like Pennsylvania, we are looking at gubernatorial races in which an abortion decision like this can play big potentially in those kinds of state and local races. So I would look there first, because to your previous guest point, there's not a lot that the U.S. Congress is going to be able to do at this point to affect this decision. But there is a lot that can be done at the state level. So I think this is where the battle is going to play out as it pertains to the midterm.
So, Rick, what's the danger of the Republicans overplaying their hand?
You know, look, I mean, I think you look at some of the numbers, and, you know, the vast majority of the United States voters, 60% plus, did not want to see Roe overturned. But then when you drill down and you start talking about things like what Kevin McCarthy was just talking about, which is support for third trimester abortion, all that vanishes. So you're seeing a polarization right now in people's rhetoric. Democrats want to make this about not just abortion, but every other civil liberty that's been adjudicated by the court in the last 20 years. And Republicans want to make it all about the worst case scenario within an abortion and not even talk about any of that stuff. So Republicans have the potential of being drawn into a larger culture war. They're pretty experienced at this kind of stuff, and the last thing I want to do is play off of the field of play that the Democrats paint.
And Rick, what about the question of things like same-sex marriage and contraception? Is that a bridge too far for Republicans, or might some Republicans want to take that on as well?
Well, I think that there's a short-term and a long-term point of view on those. Short-term, no one's going to want to talk about that stuff between now and November on the Republican side, because they've already got those voters, and there's nothing they can actually tangibly do about it right now. And it would just potentially exacerbate the opposition that is already going to be ginned up by the Roe decision. So that's why you see Kevin McCarthy ducking for cover when asked that question. Long-term, I think you start looking at the demographics of this country and who's voting, and I think you're going to see there's not a lot of popular support to overturn these popular issues. These issues came in with a wave of young voters. That's only increased. The millennial voters, over 90 million of them, look at these issues in a pretty enlightened light. So I think that it's a dangerous path to play, because there is no actual legislative potential there. There aren't anywhere near the votes in the Senate to make significant changes. So they're going to wait and see what the court does with those things.
Jeannie, thinking again about the midterm elections, and then perhaps even your favorite subject, 2024, what about the so-called suburban women?
You know, that's going to be critical because, you know, if you think about 2018, for instance, a very different time, but Democrats did very well in the midterm election, in part because they ran on health care and they were able to attract suburban women in particular. And there's a lot of talk in Democratic circles. Abortion is obviously an issue of health, and it's an issue of concern that Democrats can use in this election. Now, of course, it's a very different time. It's a very bad year for Democrats, and they do have the White House. But if there was anything that could turn the page for Democrats, short of bringing down inflation and fixing the economy, it would be a decision like this. So I do think we're going to hear a lot about it. And I would just say, and I'm sorry if I'm reading here, David, I think we're going to hear a lot from Judge Thomas's concurrence in this. He says, and I quote, "In future cases, we should reconsider the court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell." Those are the decisions that the Democrats are going to want to talk a lot about, because to Rick's point, while Republicans are going to want to avoid it, Democrats want to say this is a slippery slope. Contraception, same-sex marriage, the right to do what you want in your own bedroom, those things are next. And I think we're going to hear an awful lot about that in the coming months.
Yeah, so Rick, we're going to hear a lot about it. At the same time, I really wonder, I've read some things, you would know it far better than I do, some talk that perhaps the Democrats have taken for granted some of the people of color, particularly the Latino community. And I wonder how the Latino community is likely to respond to this, because there are some within the Latino community who are more conservative, small c conservative, from a social values point of view.
That's right. I had the benefit of working with John McCain for 25 years, and he was one of the top vote getters within the Latino community, both nationally and in the Arizona population. And the reality is Latinos have conservative values. They by and large in the state of Arizona, for instance, are Catholics. They would be a pro-life community in this context. And so Democrats have to tread lightly. I mean, we've polarized our politics on this to the point where there are no pro-choice Republicans anymore, and there used to be a bunch, and there are no pro-life Democrats anymore, and there used to be a lot. So these parties have taken on the patina of this issue, much to their detriment, frankly. And so I do think, certainly in the Hispanic community and those communities of faith that overlap minority communities, are going to be looking at this going, where are they going with this?
Okay, thank you so much to our Bloomberg contributors, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, who will be back with us later during this special 2-hour broadcast. Coming up, more on the Supreme Court's decision. We're going to speak with Radhika Rao. She's UC Hastings professor of constitutional law and former clerk to Justices Blackmun as well as Justice Marshall. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
What's happening on Wall Street?
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
It's a challenging dynamic. We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Hedge funds seem to come and go. Sometimes they're hot, sometimes they're cold, sometimes they go out of business. You've been in business for almost half a century, and you got $150 billion. What did you do that nobody else has been able to do?
What we were able to do was to be able to structure portfolios in a way that were better in terms of the returns, risks, and correlations of our investors. So to give you that an idea, in other words, you could balance things in a way. I could take different alphas, different bets in different markets, and I could carry that and put that in a fund called Pure Alpha. Then I could take different asset classes and put that in a fund which was called Pure Beta. And then we could engineer it for the customer's risk levels. Do you want it at 12% volatility, 18% vol? And then they would, whatever benchmark they wanted, we could put the alpha on top of. So they could say, I want the S&P 500 plus a 6% vol operating that way. I know it all sounds complicated, but we could design and structure things to their liking that would produce an attractive risk and return that also was not correlated with their other investment.
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you can tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
We're going straight to the White House. We're going to join in progress President Biden, who is decrying the decision of the Supreme Court today.
National consensus that most Americans of faith and backgrounds found acceptable, that have been the law of the land for most of the lifetime of Americans today. And it was a constitutional principle upheld by justices appointed by Democrat and Republican presidents alike. Roe v. Wade was a 7-2 decision written by a justice appointed by a Republican president, Richard Nixon. In the 5 decades that followed Roe v. Wade, justices appointed by Republican presidents from Eisenhower, Nixon, and Reagan, George W. Bush were among the justices who voted to uphold the principles set forth in Roe v. Wade. It was 3 justices named by one president, Donald Trump, who were the core of today's decision to upend the scales of justice and eliminate a fundamental right for women in this country. Make no mistake, this decision is a culmination of a deliberate effort over decades to upset the balance of our law. It's a realization of an extreme ideology and a tragic error by the Supreme Court, in my view. The court has done what it has never done before, expressly take away a constitutional right that is so fundamental to so many Americans that had already been recognized. The court's decision to do so will have real and immediate consequences. State laws banning abortion are automatically taking effect today, jeopardizing the health of millions of women, some without exceptions. So extreme that women could be punished for protecting their health. So extreme that women and girls were forced to bear their rapist's child. With the child, a consequence. It just stuns me. So extreme that doctors will be criminalized for fulfilling their duty to care. Imagine having a young woman have to carry a child of incest as a consequence of incest. No option. Too often the case. The poor women are going to be hit the hardest. It's cruel. In fact, the court laid out state laws criminalizing abortion that go back to the 1800s as rationale. The court literally taking America back 150 years. This is a sad day for the country, in my view. But it doesn't mean the fight's over. Let me be very clear and unambiguous. The only way we can secure a woman's right to choose, the balance that existed, is for Congress to restore the protections of Roe v. Wade as federal law. No executive action from the president can do that. And if Congress, as it appears, lacks the votes to do that now, voters need to make their voices heard. This fall, we must elect more senators and representatives who will codify women's right to choose into federal law once again. Elect more state leaders to protect this right at the local level. We need to restore the protections of Roe as law of the land. We need to elect officials who will do that. This fall, Roe is on the ballot. Personal freedoms are on the ballot. The right to privacy, liberty, equality, they're all on the ballot. Until then, I will do all of my power to protect a woman's right in states where they will face the consequences of today's decision. Well, the court's decision cast a dark shadow over a large swath of the land. Many states in this country still recognize a woman's right to choose. So, if a woman lives in a state that restricts abortion, the Supreme Court's decision does not prevent her from traveling from her home state to the state that allows it. It does not prevent a doctor in that state from treating her. As the Attorney General has made clear, women must remain free to travel safely to another state to seek care they need. My administration will defend that bedrock right. If any state or local official, high or low, tries to interfere with a woman's exercising her basic right to travel, I will do everything in my power to fight that deeply un-American attack. My administration will also protect a woman's access to medications that are approved by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, like contraception, which is essential for preventative health care, mifepristone, which the FDA approved 20 years ago to safely end early pregnancies and is commonly used to treat miscarriages. Some states are saying that they'll try to ban or severely restrict access to these medications. But extremist governors and state legislators are looking to block the mail or search a person's medicine cabinet or control a woman's actions by tracking data on her apps she uses are wrong and extreme and out of touch with the majority of Americans. The American Medical Association, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists wrote to me and Vice President Harris stressing that these laws are not based on evidence and asking us to act to protect access to care. They say by limiting access to these medicines, maternal mortality will climb in America. That's what they say. Today, I'm directing the Department of Health and Human Services to take steps to ensure these critical medications are available to the fullest extent possible. And the politicians cannot interfere in the decisions that should be made between a woman and her doctor. And my administration will remain vigilant as the implications of this decision play out. I've warned about how this decision risks the broader right to privacy for everyone. That's because Roe recognized the fundamental right to privacy that has served as a basis for so many more rights that we've come to take for granted, that are ingrained in the fabric of this country. The right to make the best decisions for your health. The right to use birth control, a married couple in the privacy of their bedroom, for God's sake. The right to marry the person you love. Justice Thomas said as much today. He explicitly called to reconsider the right of marriage equality, the right of couples to make their choices on contraception. This is extreme and dangerous path the court is now taking us on. Let me close with 2 points. First, I call on everyone, no matter how deeply they care about this decision, to keep all protests peaceful. Peaceful, peaceful, peaceful. We must stand against violence in any form, regardless of your rationale. Second, I know So many of us are frustrated and disillusioned that the court has taken something away that's so fundamental. I know so many women are now going to face incredibly difficult situations. I hear you. I support you. I stand with you. The consequences and the consensus of the American people, core principles of equality, liberty, dignity, and the stability of the rule of law demand that Roe should not have been overturned. With this decision, the conservative majority of the Supreme Court shows how extreme it is, how far removed they are from the majority of this country. They've made the United States an outlier among developed nations in the world. But this decision must not be the final word. My administration will use all of its appropriate lawful powers, but Congress must act. And with your vote, you can act. You can have the final word. This is not over. Thank you very much. More to say this in weeks to come. Thank you.
And we have been listening to and watching President Joe Biden from the White House addressing that decision this morning, the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade, as well as Casey versus Planned Parenthood. He said it was a tragic error by the Supreme Court of the United States, that it was a sad day for the court and for the country as well. But he said it does not mean that the fight is over. He specifically called on Congress to adopt a federal statute with the protection of Roe against Wade, admitting that it is now constituted. Congress would not do that, but therefore he said that the voters must speak in the midterm elections. He also said he would use all his powers with his executive branch to make sure that the right to travel was protected and also the right to receive medication approved by the FDA and contraceptives. So he is certainly very steamed up about it, but he also said, very importantly, any protests need to be peaceful. This is no occasion for intimidation or threats or violence of any sort, responding in a sense to House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's earlier remarks on that subject. We welcome now, for more on this, Tina Davis. She's Bloomberg News executive editor. So, Tina, I thought it was interesting. He specifically invoked Justice Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion about substantive due process, something that I know you focused on as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's one of the more interesting outcomes of this approach, of this ruling today. So when the draft opinion leaked last month, there was a lot of talk about what it meant for other freedoms, essentially, for gay marriage, as the president mentioned, for contraceptives, for potentially, anti-sodomy laws, striking down those. And the Alito draft opinion said quite clearly, this does not affect those other rights. This is different because it has to do with a human life, and therefore, it doesn't necessarily mean we upend the precedent behind those decisions that have already been made. However, Clarence Thomas issued, as you said, a concurring opinion in which he was alone and saying, look, we need to look at all of these things. And that is actually referenced directly in the dissent from the liberal justices that were against this ruling.
We had the three liberal justices. We also had Justice Kavanaugh joined by Chief Justice Roberts, concurring in the judgment, not in the opinion. And if Clarence Thomas wanted to go farther, both Justice Kavanaugh and the Chief Justice didn't want to go as far.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting opinion because you get to see a little bit of how the court is shaking out as we see these new justices coming into their own, including Kavanaugh and Barrett. And Gorsuch not so much, but the three justices essentially that were put on the court by Donald Trump, we get to see what role they're playing. I think what's particularly interesting to me is looking at the role that Roberts played. Roberts joined the liberal minority in voting against overturning Roe v. Wade. And that's something that's going to make him, I think, a target for a lot of conservatives who feel like he's not actually that conservative as they thought he was going to be when he took over. He was obviously not appointed by Trump, but he was appointed by Bush prior. But he was an interesting vote, I think, in that this is someone who's tried to lead the court in a very old-fashioned way. He's very much an institutionalist, and the court seems to not necessarily be following him.
Yeah, exactly. We talk about conservatives or liberals. He's sort of for the institution, it appears, in a lot of his decision making. Thank you so much, Tina. It's great to have you with us. That's Tina Davis of Bloomberg. And now we want to turn to an authority on the court and on constitutional law. She's Radhika Rao. She's UC Hastings professor of constitutional law, and she clerked in the past for Justice Blackmun as well as Justice Marshall. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. Let's pick up on just exactly what Tina was talking about, and that is Chief Justice Roberts and his position here, joining in the judgment, not in the opinion, joining the opinion instead of Kavanaugh. What does this decision, do you think, mean about the institution of the Supreme Court?
I think this decision is very revealing, and it's actually I agree with Biden, it's a dark day for the court and a dark day for the country and for all of the women across the country who are going to be affected. What does this decision mean specifically in terms of Roberts' opinion? He does say that he would have taken a more measured course and he would only uphold this law, but not overturn Roe. He essentially wants to bide his time and to wait until it's necessary before overturning Roe. But he's not really saying that he thinks that, that there is a constitutional right to an abortion, only that the court should issue a more narrow ruling at this point.
So, Professor, I'm curious about one thing. As a scholar of the Supreme Court, I ask you this. Roe versus Wade was on the books for about 50 years or so. It strikes me that the country did not come together to support it. It feels as divided today as it was the day it was decided. Does that tell us something about the decision? Bearing in mind that you did clerk for Justice Blackmun, the author of Roe against Wade.
Yes, I do think that the decision is divisive, but I actually think the court, Justice Alito's opinion in Dobbs, purports to suggest that overturning Roe is going to bring the country together. I think it's going to have exactly the opposite impact. We are already seeing the fallout of what you might call the interjurisdictional abortion wars, where the red states are getting redder and the blue states are getting bluer. In the red states, they're trying to prohibit abortion, not only within the state, but really to limit the ability of women to travel to other states to seek abortion. And in the blue states, we're seeing the attempt to immunize against prosecution their physicians who prescribe abortion medications for those in other states. So really, this decision is leading us to even greater polarization, even greater division.
Professor, let's pick up on that because we just heard from President Biden saying that he's going to use the full force of his office to make sure that you can't interfere, for example, with travel, interstate travel for the purpose of abortion. Does that raise further constitutional issues if a state does try to impede that?
It does. It definitely raises issues about the constitutional right to travel. And one of the good things about this opinion is Justice Kavanaugh, in his concurring opinion, suggested that he thought that there was, in fact, a constitutional right to travel. Some of those constitutional right to travel precedents, however, are a little bit murky, and they really haven't been invoked. So the problem will be how many justices will actually sign on, ultimately, to a constitutional right to travel when the issue comes before the court.
Okay, Professor, really great to have you on today. Thank you very much for being here. It's Radhika Rao of UC Hastings Law School. I want you to check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, we're going to stay on the air for a second hour of coverage on Balance of Power on both TV and radio. The special coverage of the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade, as well as Casey versus Planned Parenthood. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
But ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Diversity, life would be excruciatingly dull. It's something worth celebrating. It's something that makes us stronger as communities, as businesses, and as individuals.
I see the benefits at Bloomberg on a daily basis. It's beyond flying that rainbow flag. It's about taking the discussions out into the world and making a genuine difference.
With David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to our second hour of Balance of Power as we continue coverage of the Supreme Court's overturning of the Roe versus Wade abortion rights ruling. And first, we want to go to the place where it all began at 10:10 Eastern Time this morning, the Supreme Court of the United States itself, when they handed down that momentous decision in the Dunn case, overturning both Roe against Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood. We go to our man on the scene. He's Washington correspondent Joe Matthew. He is, of course, the host of Sound On and joins us from outside the Supreme Court. So Joe, I want to start actually with the important point we were talking about before, which is we're hearing a lot from people who are very upset about this decision. I understand why they are. We can sort of overlook the fact that there are a fair number of people who like it. Let's start actually by going back to what Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, said earlier today. This is where
the voiceless will finally have a voice. This great nation can now live up to its core principle that all are created equal, not born equal.
Who feel pretty good about this decision in all likelihood.
Oh, absolutely. And they're represented in the crowd behind me, David. There's been a lot of chanting, a lot of yelling, and a lot of singing over the last couple of hours in front of the Supreme Court. But you're right. Over the past hour, we have heard both sides of this issue presented by both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Kevin McCarthy there, widely believed to be the next Speaker of the House if Republicans take the majority, delivering the lines that you just played for us, while President Biden called this a sad day for the court and a sad day for America. Remarkable as well to hear President Biden call out the former president by name, saying it was 3 justices named by one president, Donald Trump, who are at the core of this decision. The president also calling for calm as there have been threats of violence and vandalism tonight, a night of rage, as some activists have called it. The White House has been consistent, though, David, over the past couple of days that they will not tolerate violence. And law enforcement here in the nation's capital, they say they are prepared. There's a massive fence, a massive barrier that's been set up around the Supreme Court since that first draft opinion leaked. That was many weeks ago. It's still there, although we have seen a very wide police presence since 10 o'clock this morning, David.
Yeah, and it looks, at least from the video, it looks like it's a fairly tame, fairly organized grouping there. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Joe Matthew. He's host of Sound On. You want to catch that this afternoon at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. And now we go to Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr. Greg, you heard what the president is saying this basically has never happened before in history, the Supreme Court taking away a fundamental right. Is he right?
More or less, yes. Certainly no right as consequential as this, a right that transformed the lives of millions of women and sparked this decades-long movement to overturn it. It is unquestionably a historic day.
Okay, and as a practical matter, what kind of divisions are there on the court from this? Because it was not really a 6-3 decision; it was 5-1-3, right? There was 2-3.
Well, at least Chief Justice John Roberts is the one who said, I would uphold this Mississippi law that bans abortion after 15 weeks, but I wouldn't go so far as to overturn Roe. And in fact, he suggested that he might actually have upheld a much narrower right to terminate a pregnancy, at least earlier in pregnancy. There's also a key opinion by Justice Brett Kavanaugh. He concurred, he joined the majority opinion, voted to overturn Roe, but he also said, for example, that he would not vote to uphold a state that tried to restrict travel by somebody to a state where abortion is allowed. He also said he would not support retroactive punishment for people who had abortions. So he's probably a pivotal vote going forward as we battle over future restrictions.
Okay, Greg, thank you so much for all your coverage today, which is not done yet, I suspect. It's Greg Stohr. He's Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter. Joining us now is Donald Ayer. He's former Principal Deputy Solicitor General in the Reagan administration and was Deputy Attorney General in the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush. He's now an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law. So, Don, thank you so much for being with us. If you'll indulge me here, I want to play something that we just heard from President Biden, where he said that basically this is unprecedented what the Supreme Court's done. This is what President Biden just had to say.
Today, the Supreme Court of the United States expressly took away a constitutional right from the American people that it had already recognized. They didn't limit it, they simply took it away. That's never been done to a right so important to so many Americans. But they did it. It's a sad day for the court and for the country.
So, Don, talk about this just as a matter of Supreme Court history and precedent. Obviously, overturning an important precedent of some 50 years is a big deal. It's not the first time the Supreme Court has ever done that. They did it in Brown against Board of Education. But is this the first time they did it in a way that took away a fundamental right?
I believe it is, yeah. And if you think in terms of our Bill of Rights and other ways that people's rights to engage in certain kinds of behavior or conduct, this is the first instance, I believe, where the court has simply said, and here after 49 or so years, there was a constitutional right recognized that existed, and we're taking it away.
One of the things that I've been asked today, at least, is how could they do this when a majority of Americans, according to polls at least, do not favor taking away this right? It's something like, I don't know, 60, 65% say that there should be some right of abortion of some form. But on the other hand, Don, the Supreme Court's not there to reflect the will of the majority of the people on a given day, right?
Well, that's right. And I don't think anybody thinks that they should be there to purely reflect the will of the majority. But one of the important things that's occurred pretty graphically in the last 2 days with the gun case decided yesterday and the leaked opinion in Dobbs having come out, a couple months ago. The court has now made clear that they have a vision of their own omniscience in terms of what the founders meant to do, and a sense of sort of an absolutist view of what the Constitution means. They've specifically said in this opinion, and something pretty similar in the opinion yesterday, that they're not going to be influenced by thinking about consequences in the form of how people will react, or in the context of the gun case yesterday, consequences in the sense of weighing what's going to happen if a certain regulation is invalidated. They appear to be ready to simply go off and follow their sense of what the founders wanted and just implement it and not really pay attention to where that may take the country.
I wonder where we're going next. I mean, it's impossible to know, but we can certainly speculate about it because there's a lot of talk about how far this decision may reach into things like contraception and same-sex marriage. And we do have a concurring opinion from Justice Thomas, basically saying, yeah, those are on the list now. We're going to take a hard look at that. Do we have any sense of how far the ramifications of this opinion may go?
I don't think we do, and I wouldn't predict that that's going to happen, even though it's pretty clear that Justice Thomas, it's very clear from his opinion that he would go there. I think what is more ominous even than that is something that isn't really being very much talked about it, but this same court has a vision of certain other rights which it is ready to expand. It has expanded certain forms of First Amendment speech rights. It's expanded free exercise rights under the First Amendment. It's expanded the takings clause. It's expanded a bunch of rights based on its sort of vision and sense of, I guess, the founders' intention. I don't really know. But in a way that has a common theme, and that common theme is to impair and undermine the functioning of government. One good example of that are the cases it decided that invalidated local government restrictions for COVID safety purposes. But there's a lot more, and there's a case coming up in the next day or two that's dealing with the Clean Air Act. And the court is pretty likely to take a narrow textualist reading of that statute, which may well lead us to a very narrow reading of the Clean Air Act and again, impairing the function of government, which I think is going to be the dominant theme of their upcoming jurisprudence.
Don, you have a lot of experience in Washington, a lot of experience in the Justice Department, and specifically I'd like to draw upon your experience in the Solicitor General's office. The Solicitor General, of course, represents the United States in the Supreme Court. You've spent a lot of time in that court. You've argued cases. You know how it works. Is this going to generate a lot more litigation? Because already we're talking about things like maybe states restricting travel outside the state or restricting doctors, things like that. Could we have a lot of abortion litigation following on from this?
I think it's possible, but I don't think you know to what degree the Supreme Court is going to participate in that. I think, the bigger concern that I have is that the court, this 5-member, majority, now seems to be ready to act in what I would have to characterize as pretty extreme ways, if yesterday and today are any indication. And I think that's going to invite a sea of litigation from people rubbing their hands together saying, aha, we have a court that will take our case on X issue because they're in sync with us. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that kind of litigation. And it worries me because I don't know what the limits of this court are going to be. And if they're not, if what's happened so far is bad enough that it's going to undermine trust by a lot of people. And if they keep it up, it's going to get worse and worse.
Okay, Don, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it. That's Donald Ayer, a true veteran of the Justice Department and now an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law. Coming up, Barbara Perry, professor and director of presidential studies at University of Virginia's Miller Center, is going to join us. This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
Join me on Leaders with Lacroix as we explore what drives the most influential people on the planet. Leaders with Lacroix on Bloomberg Television, TV Go, and Bloomberg.com.
You will put a woman on Mars. You will bring forth global cooling. Because when you subscribe to Bloomberg, you won't just get news. You will get insight into limitless possibilities. Before you change the world, Bloomberg.
This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West, and we are really focused today on the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe against Wade, as well as Casey versus Planned Parenthood. But I must say, I hadn't been paying attention to the markets, and they are up. For our Bloomberg audience, you should know equity markets are all up over 2% right now. So continuing that little rally, whether it's a bear market rally or not. In the meantime, let's turn back to that decision. One of the important questions is how this decision, an historic decision, everyone agrees, fits into the history of the Supreme Court and what it does to it as an institution. For some answers on that, we go now to Barbara Perry. She's professor and director of presidential studies at University of Virginia's Miller Center. She has served as a U.S. Supreme Court fellow and has worked for both Republican and Democratic members of the Senate. So, Barbara, thank you so much for being with us. Put this in historical context. How does it fit?
I've been studying the history of the court and the Constitution for over 4 decades now. And I can't remember a case that had such impact across such a broad swath of the American people. So I think that's the first thing to note. It depending on what side a person's on, it doesn't really matter in this sense. These are matters of life and death, literally. So I think we have to focus on that and then say, what is the impact on the court? And that is that when it wades into these issues, no pun intended on Roe v. Wade, but when it wades into these issues of life and death, it means that it's going to generate a lot of emotion on both sides.
So one of the things that we've heard said, including by the President of the United States, that this has never been done before, that the Supreme Court has taken back a fundamental right. At the same time, one of the criticisms is it was a 50-year precedent, and we do have stare decisis, and we respect that, at least try to whenever we can. But I wonder, is that right? I mean, Brown versus Board of Education didn't take away a right, it gave a right, but it overturned a much older precedent, did it not?
It did. It overturned one that was some 50 some odd years old, going all the way back to 1896 in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which allowed for public segregation in that case of transportation, trains in particular. So yes, we do have overturning of precedent on occasion. Usually people think in terms of progress being made when something is overturned. It also means that time marches on, things change in society, despite the fact that justices in this majority talk about being originalists and going back to the founders' intentions as they wrote the Constitution and the amendments that have come since then. But times do change, and sometimes the court keeps up with the times, and sometimes it does not.
Barbara, it strikes me that in Roe against Wade back in 1973, the court generated a lot of controversy in the country, but for itself as well, a controversy that really didn't die down much that I could tell over some 50 years. At the same time, the court is right back into the controversy now. What does that do to it as an institution in its credibility with the populace?
I've been thinking along those same lines, David, certainly all day. And it is the case that Justice Scalia on the conservative side used to say, oh, ever since Roe v. Wade, we've been inundated with mail, and every anniversary in January of Roe v. Wade. Thousands of pro-life marchers come and march around the court. So wouldn't it be great if we could put this aside in some fashion? In his case, it would have been to overturn Roe v. Wade. But we see in their picture here on screen that there are people out in front of the court. And it's very unusual to see those kinds of fences around the court. So I think, again, it shows the kind of emotion. The notion of precedent that you mentioned previously, the reason courts have tended to want to hold on to precedent is that we don't want fundamental law to be changing every day or even every 50 years. It puts uncertainty into the law. So I think part and parcel of this, along with the leak of this opinion a couple of months ago, has led to the low approval ratings for the court. It's down around the 40% range and might go lower because a majority of Americans do support a right to access to abortion, at least in the early stages of pregnancy.
Barbara, what does this decision do to the leadership of the Chief Justice? You talk about approval ratings. I'm not sure where his are right now, but he's sort of in the middle, joining in the judgment, not in the opinion. Clearly, he's an institutionalist, but is he really leading this court at this point? Or, to be blunt with you, is Clarence Thomas?
I think Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito are leading the court now, and I think that Chief Justice Roberts, who when he first came on the bench in 2005 said that he would hope to engage in a number of decisions and lead decisions that would, if not be unanimous, at least be 6-7 or even 8-1. He's not seeing that now. And so I think it also shows you how far to the right the court has moved, given that he's now viewed as a centrist. Your old boss, Justice Lewis Powell, a great justice, I admire him so much, was viewed as the swing justice, and he truly was a moderate. He tended to be in the middle between conservatives and liberals. But it shows you how far the court has moved to the right, given that the Chief Justice is now viewed as being in the center, but he doesn't have control of that center as Justice Powell did.
Well, that's nice of you to say that about Justice Powell. I certainly agree. He was a wonderful man, a great justice, in my opinion. Finally, though, I wonder also, the Supreme Court doesn't issue decisions for popularity. At the same time, if it issues a controversial decision and it doesn't get the country to get behind it sooner or later, does it have a problem? Brown versus Board of Education, 50 years afterwards, not too many people were saying it was a mistake. I'm not sure that you can say it about Roe versus Wade.
I don't think so. Again, it's a majority that shows maybe this will mold public opinion in a different way, but I tend to doubt it. Another example of this that didn't really involve life versus death, but the famous or infamous, depending on one's viewpoint, 1962 decision that banned publicly written laws that required prayer in public school, and the prayer would be written by the state, in that case, New York. And that was hardly ever followed in public schools, particularly in the Bible Belt in those days. So sometimes the court has been ignored. In this instance, it obviously has more of an impact on people's very lives.
Okay, Barbara, it's always a treat to get to talk to you, and particularly on something as important as this decision. That's Barbara Perry. She's professor and director of presidential studies at University of Virginia's Miller Center. Coming up, more coverage of the U.S. Supreme Court overturning that historic abortion ruling. This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
Some bonds last a lifetime. Some bonds inspire confidence. And some you grow to rely on.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management. It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're continuing now with our special coverage of that Supreme Court decision today overturning Roe versus Wade. And we are joined once again by Tina Davis, our Bloomberg legal executive editor. So welcome back, Tina. Good to have you back. So we've heard now from President Biden. We actually interviewed Senator Smith, Tina Smith from Minnesota, about the possibility of a federal congressional statute. People don't think that's going to happen with this Congress. What else could happen in response to this? The question is, what's the next shoe to drop, particularly for those who are trying to preserve some right to an abortion?
Right. Well, aside from federal options, this battle basically now moves to the states, to the individual states. We've already seen the ACLU and Planned Parenthood talking about lawsuits. I believe one is already filed in Michigan. They're talking about a lawsuit in Ohio. What they're doing there is they're challenging any laws that may ban abortion as a result of this ruling. As you well know, David, when the Supreme Court issues these things, they have to also issue the judgments. That paperwork sometimes takes a while, so they're trying to take advantage of the lag time between this opinion and when it gets codified into essentially statute, to basically say we want to make sure that individual states still have this power. Some states like New York are moving to put this in the Constitution and other efforts, but in Michigan, we've seen an attorney general there who's been quite clear that she's not going to go forward with the laws that are on the books that would force her to make abortion illegal as a result of this ruling.
Which may lead to a further division between the so-called red and the so-called blue states. We may have two very different United States of America existing side by side when it comes to abortion.
Well, and even more than that, I mean, you've seen in Louisiana, which has been very vocal about, their trigger laws that come into effect. The district attorney of New Orleans has said that he's not going to enforce that law in the city. So, it's not only a red versus blue state. It could, be as much as, what block you live on in terms of whether or not the law enforcement agencies are going to move forward with the laws as written.
So we have some possible workarounds at the state level in terms of governments, but also we're getting the private sector reacting. A number of companies now have come out and said what they're going to do in response.
Yeah, we've had a few companies today that have responded. There have been companies previously, certainly when the Texas law came into effect, we saw some companies that were very vocal. Uber and Citibank, I believe, both said, look, we're going to offer our employees the ability, some support and some money if they need to travel out of state for this kind of healthcare, that we will do that. Today we had JP Morgan saying that. We've had CVS and a few other companies that are basically saying it's in our best interest to make sure that our employees have access to all the health care they need, and they're looking to even out any iniquities based on where an employee is based.
Yeah, of course, that leaves out people who aren't fortunate enough to work at JP Morgan, or I think Meta has done that. Disney said something as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be, I think, the larger companies, the companies that obviously can afford to take on this extra amount of cost. But, in an era like we have now where, the unemployment is so low and there is such a battle for the workforce, this might be another thing that you could use to try to make yourself attractive to a worker.
Thank you so much for all your work on this today, which is not finished, I'm afraid, Tina. That's Tina Davis of Bloomberg. Coming up, we're going to talk with Lawrence Tribe, professor of constitutional law at Harvard Law School, and considered one of the nation's leading constitutional scholars. That's coming up next. This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
What do Formula One cars and your local supermarket have in common? Well, strange as it sounds, they might both be using the same technology. A lot of innovation has trickled down from the world of high-tech engines, and it hasn't just found a new life in road cars. F1 cars have long been thought of as the peak of cool, and technology in them is also helping to cool down our produce aisles. Engineers from Williams are using their knowledge from 9 Constructors' Championships, working with company Aerofoil to help reduce the energy consumption of supermarkets. The device they're building is based on the design of an F1 car's rear wing. It attaches to fridges to keep more cool air in the unit. They estimate it can reduce supermarket energy consumption by 25%. One innovation from F1 is also helping hybrids reduce their carbon footprint. That's KERS, or the Kinetic Energy Recovery System. In common parlance, it's known as regenerative braking and works by storing energy of the car decelerating in a battery for later use. If that's not enough, F1 is now looking at TERS, or a thermal energy recovery system, looking to harness the heat produced from braking and the engine exhaust. That could allow cars to generate the same power using 30% less fuel. So while F1 may have a reputation as a gas guzzler, some of its innovations in the name of speed are helping in the everyday fight against climate change.
You will put a woman on Mars. You will be the first chief crypto officer, because when you subscribe to Bloomberg, you won't just get news. You will get insight into limitless possibilities. Before you change the world, Bloomberg.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West, and it's high time we got to check on the markets because we have a nice rally going in equities, and Abigail Doolittle is here to tell us all about it.
A very nice rally indeed, David. On the day, we have the major indexes up more than 2%. That S&P 500 right now near session highs up 2.4%. The tech-heavy NASDAQ up about an equal amount, up 2.5%. Perhaps the bigger picture is on the week, we have the S&P 500 up about 6%, the first up week in 4, the best week since the end of May. Of course, the big question is what's behind this rally? I would argue it has to do with the fact that investors are digesting the FOMC decision from last week, that it's this Goldilocks tightening. We also have this Goldilocks balance right now between inflation and a recession, along with data. The fact that data isn't too strong, but it's not too bad either, puts us right in that scenario as well. So a bit of a Goldilocks scenario here. The question is it a bear market rally or is it the start of a bounce? I stick with the bear market rally, but I feel like this one, I said this the other day, I feel like this one could be pretty convincing. It may not just be a week or two. It could actually be a little bit longer.
You did say that. I'll agree with that. That's exactly right. Thank you so much, Abigail Doolittle, for that report on the markets. In the meantime, we want to continue that story of that Supreme Court decision that came down at 10:10 Eastern Time today. Go back up to the Supreme Court itself, where we have Joe Matthews, Washington correspondent and host of Sound On every day of the week on Bloomberg Radio. So, Joe, first of all, just bring us up to date on the demonstration or the gathering up there. What are you seeing?
This crowd has been hanging around for a couple of hours now, David. It was a little bit bigger in the moments after the ruling was announced, and we saw lines of people streaming up to Capitol Hill and to the Supreme Court behind me. But I'll tell you, those who remain are very vocal. There are signs that I could not read on the air, this being a family program. There are also chants that might be familiar from events like these: no justice, no peace. We've heard music playing, we've heard songs singing. And this represents both sides. We need to be clear. There are pro-choice and pro-life activists who have gathered outside the Supreme Court in the hundreds and even thousands at various points of the day. And of course, that brings about the issue of security. Capitol Police have really lined themselves up around this whole area between the Supreme Court and the U.S. Capitol. And we know that the justices are being protected at their homes as well. It was just last week the president signed into law this legislation that gives justices' families the opportunity to enjoy the same protection if the marshal of the Supreme Court suggested. And that's exactly what we have seen since the attempt on Justice Kavanaugh's life, or at least the arrest, believing that was the case up in Maryland. So things have been, I won't use the word calm, but certainly secure so far, David.
So Joe, I'm going to throw you a curveball, but it's one you can certainly hit out of the park, because as you were talking, we got word that the House has now passed that bipartisan gun safety bill, and it's headed to the president's desk. I mean, there's so much news coming out of Washington right now. That's not a big surprise, but it is a big development.
Well, that's true. As a matter of fact, the Senate got this done in very quick time. The vote last night to pass this on a bipartisan level, and it was expected that the House would follow. But, you know, we're talking about this ruling being significant over the last 50 years of history, and this legislation is significant over the last 30 years of history. There have been a number of attempts following mass shootings in this country, but never until we've seen this following the shootings in Uvalde and Buffalo have we seen something come together into legislation, remembering that John Cornyn, the Republican from Texas, and Mitch McConnell himself, the minority leader in the Senate, signed off on these talks. They got things together with Democrats, and here we are with an incentive for states to pass red flag laws and expanded background checks for people under 21. The president's expected to sign that imminently, David.
A whole lot of history being made down in Washington right now. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Joe Matthew, host of Sound On. You can listen to him tonight.